Hello there, and welcome to Secretum Histories, where the past is told slowly, carefully, and in a way that lets the mind rest while history continues to unfold. Tonight we turn our attention to a figure whose name has never quite faded. A woman who stood at the meeting point of empires, languages, ambition and survival. Cleopatra, the last queen of Egypt. A ruler remembered as a seductress, a strategist, a scholar, a symbol, and sometimes a warning. Her story has been polished by Roman poets, reshaped by playwrights, painted onto marble and film, and passed down in tones that rarely agree with one another. Some remember her reclining on golden couches. Others see her standing at the bow of a ship beneath purple sails. Many imagine her as a beauty first and a ruler second. Yet behind the legend stood a young woman born into a fragile dynasty, surrounded by rivalry, expectation, and a kingdom that had already begun to lean heavily on Rome. Before there were dramatic meetings with generals or whispered alliances across candlelit halls, there was a child raised in a palace overlooking the Mediterranean Sea, in a city built by one of the most ambitious conquerors the world had ever known. Wherever you are listening from tonight, whether the air outside is cool or warm, whether the hour is late or simply quiet, imagine for a moment the shoreline of ancient Alexandria. The harbour is busy with merchant ships. The lighthouse of Pharos stands tall, guiding vessels safely through dark waters. The streets echo with Greek, Egyptian and Latin. Libraries hold scrolls from distant lands. In that city, sometime in 69 BCE, Cleopatra the seventh Philopator was born into the Ptolemaic dynasty, a Greek royal family that had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries. If this quiet journey through the past brings you comfort, if history told at an unhurried pace helps you unwind at the end of your day, a small gesture of support, such as a like or a subscription, helps this calm space continue to grow. It allows these stories to reach others who might also appreciate a steady voice and a thoughtful return to the ancient world. Cleopatra's Egypt was not the Egypt of pyramid builders or early pharaohs. By the time she entered the world, the Great Pyramid of Giza was already more than 2,000 years old. The language of administration in the royal court was Greek. The rulers carried both Egyptian and Macedonian traditions, yet they were descendants of Ptolemy I, one of Alexander the Great's generals. After Alexander's death in 323 BCE, his vast empire fractured, and Ptolemy claimed Egypt as his share. He and his successors ruled not as native pharaohs in origin, but as foreign monarchs who adopted Egyptian titles and customs to strengthen their authority. The Ptolemaic rulers married within their own family. Brothers married sisters. Power stayed tightly bound to bloodlines. These arrangements were meant to preserve legitimacy, yet they also created tension, suspicion, and rivalry within palace walls. Cleopatra was born into this complicated tradition. Her father, Ptolemy XII Auletes, ruled Egypt during a period of increasing Roman influence. Rome, still technically a republic at the time, was expanding its reach across the Mediterranean. Its generals and senators watched Egypt carefully, aware of its wealth, grain supply and strategic position. Ptolemy XII struggled to maintain stability. He relied heavily on Rome for support, paying enormous sums to secure recognition of his rule. This dependence weakened Egypt's independence and strained its treasury. Cleopatra grew up in a palace where political maneuvering was not an occasional event but a constant necessity. She witnessed how alliances were formed, how debts were negotiated, and how quickly favour could turn into exile. Unlike many of her predecessors, Cleopatra was known for her education. Ancient sources suggest that she spoke multiple languages, including Egyptian, which set her apart from earlier Ptolemaic rulers, who often relied on translators when addressing their own people. She was trained in philosophy, rhetoric, mathematics, astronomy, and statecraft. Alexandria's great library, though already past its peak, still symbolized a culture of learning. Cleopatra absorbed this intellectual environment. She was not merely a ceremonial figure. From an early age, she was being shaped to understand the mechanics of power. Her childhood unfolded in a city that blended cultures. Greek architecture stood beside Egyptian temples. Scholars debated ideas imported from Athens. Priests performed rituals that had been practiced for centuries along the Nile. Trade routes connected Alexandria to Rome, to the Levant, to North Africa. Ships carried grain, papyrus, spices, and glass. Wealth flowed through the harbour, yet so did anxiety. Rome's shadow grew longer each year. When Cleopatra was still a teenager, her father was temporarily driven from power during a local uprising. He fled to Rome to seek assistance. The throne was unstable, and Cleopatra likely learned then how fragile authority could be. Ptolemy XII eventually returned with Roman military backing, reclaiming his position but at a high cost. Egypt's autonomy was further compromised, and Roman officials gained greater leverage in Egyptian affairs. In 51 BCE, when Cleopatra was around 18 years old, her father died. His will, reportedly deposited in Rome, named Cleopatra and her younger brother Ptolemy XIII as co-rulers. This arrangement followed Ptolemaic custom. A brother and sister would share the throne, and in theory they would marry to solidify their joint claim. In practice, such partnerships rarely remained harmonious. Cleopatra stepped into power at a time of crisis. The Nile's flooding had been inconsistent, affecting agriculture. Famine threatened parts of the population. Rome was in the midst of its own internal tensions, with figures like Julius Caesar and Pompey competing for dominance. Egypt's leadership required careful balance. Cleopatra initially ruled alongside her brother, whose advisors quickly sought to assert his independence from her influence. Court politics hardened. Advisors surrounding Ptolemy XIII viewed Cleopatra as a rival. Coins were minted bearing her image, emphasizing her authority. Soon, open conflict emerged between the siblings. Cleopatra was forced to leave Alexandria, effectively pushed out by those who controlled her brother's inner circle. She did not disappear quietly. Instead, she began gathering support, preparing to reclaim her position. This early exile shaped her approach to rule. Cleopatra learned that symbolic authority meant little without military and political backing. She understood that Egypt alone might not withstand Rome's growing dominance. Survival required alliances that extended beyond the palace. At this same time, Rome's civil war intensified. Julius Caesar and Pompey clashed for control of the Republic. Pompey eventually fled to Egypt after suffering defeat. Hoping to win Caesar's favour, Ptolemy XIII's advisors ordered Pompey's execution upon his arrival. They believed presenting Caesar with his rival's severed head would earn gratitude. Instead, it horrified him. Caesar had not intended for Pompey to be murdered in such a manner. When Caesar arrived in Alexandria in 48 BCE, Egypt's internal struggle intersected with Rome's power struggle. Cleopatra saw an opportunity. If she could secure Caesar's support, she could regain her throne. Ancient accounts describe her dramatic entry into the palace, smuggled in to meet Caesar privately. The image of her being carried inside, wrapped in bedding, has endured for centuries. Whether every detail is accurate remains uncertain, yet the essence of the story holds. Cleopatra positioned herself not as a victim, but as a capable ruler seeking recognition. Caesar was reportedly impressed by her intelligence and composure. Their alliance shifted the balance in Alexandria. Fighting broke out between Caesar's forces and those loyal to Ptolemy XIII. The conflict, known as the Alexandrian War, spread through the city. Fires damaged parts of Alexandria, possibly including sections of its famous library. Eventually, Ptolemy XIII drowned while fleeing across the Nile. Cleopatra was restored to the throne. She formally ruled alongside another younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, though real authority rested firmly with her. Her relationship with Caesar extended beyond politics. She bore a son, Ptolemy XV, known as Caesarion. His existence tied Egypt's future to Rome's most powerful general. For Cleopatra, this alliance was strategic. Rome was no longer a distant republic with occasional influence. It was the central force shaping Mediterranean politics. By aligning herself with Caesar, she aimed to protect Egypt's autonomy and secure her dynasty's continuation. In 46 BCE, Cleopatra travelled to Rome with Caesarion. She stayed in a villa outside the city. Her presence caused unease among Roman elites. A foreign queen living near the heart of the Republic challenged traditional sensibilities. Statues were erected in her honour. Rumours circulated. Caesar's political opponents used her presence to suggest that he harboured monarchical ambitions. Then, in 44 BCE, Caesar was assassinated. His death destabilised Rome once again. Cleopatra returned to Egypt, aware that her position depended on the outcome of Rome's next power struggle. Caesarion remained in Egypt, declared co-ruler. Ptolemy XIV soon died under circumstances that remained debated, leaving Cleopatra and her son as joint sovereigns. The stage was set for another alliance, this time with Mark Antony, one of Rome's leading figures after Caesar's death. Yet that encounter lay a little further ahead. Cleopatra first needed to stabilise her kingdom, reinforce its economy, and navigate the shifting loyalties of Roman commanders. Egypt under her rule was not merely a backdrop for romance or spectacle. It was a complex administrative state, with agricultural systems tied to the Nile cycles, trade networks across the eastern Mediterranean, and temples that reinforced royal legitimacy. Cleopatra embraced her role as pharaoh in Egyptian tradition. She appeared in temple reliefs dressed in traditional regalia, presenting offerings to the gods. She understood the importance of symbolism in maintaining domestic support. At the same time, she remained deeply engaged with Hellenistic culture. Alexandria continued to function as a centre of scholarship and commerce. Cleopatra's court blended Greek and Egyptian elements, reflecting the layered identity of her kingdom. Her reign unfolded against the backdrop of Rome's transformation from republic to empire. Each decision she made had implications far beyond the Nile Delta. Roman generals saw Egypt not only as a strategic ally but as a prize. As Cleopatra consolidated her authority, the Mediterranean world shifted once again. After Caesar's assassination, Rome divided among powerful men. Mark Antony controlled the eastern provinces. Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, manoeuvred for influence in the west. The fragile alliance among Rome's leaders would not last indefinitely. Cleopatra prepared to meet Antony on her own terms. She would sail to Tarsus in 41 BCE, presenting herself not as a supplicant but as a sovereign equal. The encounter would reshape both her fate and Egypt's future. For now, the young queen who had once been forced into exile stood firmly at the head of her kingdom. She had navigated rivalry within her own family, civil war in Rome, and military conflict in Alexandria. Her story was only beginning to gather momentum. The alliances she formed next would draw Egypt deeper into Rome's internal struggles, setting the stage for decisions that would determine whether her dynasty endured or vanished into history's long current. And as the wider Mediterranean moved steadily toward another confrontation, the foundations of that coming alliance began to take shape in the eastern provinces, where Rome's influence and Egypt's ambition were about to meet. Long before Cleopatra stood on a palace balcony overlooking the harbour of Alexandria, Egypt had already changed in ways that would shape every decision she would one day make. The land of the Nile, so often imagined as timeless and unchanging, had spent centuries adjusting to foreign influence, foreign rulers, and foreign ideas. By the time Cleopatra was born, Egypt was no longer ruled by dynasties that traced their lineage back to the pyramid builders. Instead, it was governed by a Greek family whose roots lay far from the sands of the Nile. To understand Cleopatra's world, it helps to look backward, to a time when Egypt first came under the shadow of Greece. This shift did not happen overnight. It was the result of conquest, ambition, and the reshaping of an ancient kingdom by a young Macedonian king whose campaigns altered the map of the known world. In 332 BCE, Alexander III of Macedon, later known as Alexander the Great, entered Egypt. He was 24 years old, already victorious against the Persian Empire in several major battles. The Persian rulers who had controlled Egypt were unpopular. When Alexander arrived, he was not greeted as a foreign oppressor, but as a liberator. Egyptian priests acknowledged him as pharaoh. He participated in traditional rituals. He travelled to the oracle of Amun at Siwa, where he was declared the son of a god, reinforcing his legitimacy in Egyptian religious terms. Alexander did not remain in Egypt long. His ambitions lay further east. Yet before departing, he made a decision that would permanently reshape the country's future. He founded a new city on the Mediterranean coast, between the sea and Lake Mareotis. He named it Alexandria. Unlike the ancient capitals of Memphis or Thebes, Alexandria was designed as a Greek city. Its streets followed a grid pattern. Its architecture reflected Hellenistic style. It was intended as a bridge between Greek and Egyptian worlds, a port city that would connect the Nile's wealth to the wider Mediterranean. When Alexander died unexpectedly in 323 BCE, his vast empire fractured almost immediately. His generals, known as the Diadochi, fought for control of different territories. Egypt fell to one of his most capable commanders, Ptolemy, the son of Lagus. Ptolemy seized Alexander's body and brought it to Egypt, an act that was both symbolic and strategic. Possessing the body of the conqueror strengthened his claim to rule in Egypt. Ptolemy declared himself king in 305 BCE, becoming Ptolemy the First Soter. He established what would become the Ptolemaic dynasty, a Greek royal house that would rule Egypt for nearly 300 years. Although they adopted Egyptian royal titles and were depicted in temple reliefs in traditional pharaonic style, the Ptolemies remained culturally Greek. They spoke Greek at court. Their administration functioned largely in Greek. Their elite institutions reflected Hellenistic traditions. Egypt did not lose its identity overnight. The countryside continued to speak Egyptian. Temples maintained ancient rituals. Priests recorded religious texts in hieroglyphs and demotic script. Yet at the top of the political structure, a new language and a new culture dominated. The Ptolemies faced a delicate challenge. They were foreign rulers governing one of the oldest civilizations on Earth. To maintain authority, they needed both Greek and Egyptian support. They encouraged Greek settlement in Egypt, granting land to soldiers and immigrants. Alexandria grew into a cosmopolitan city filled with merchants, scholars, sailors, and administrators from across the Mediterranean. Meanwhile, traditional Egyptian cities remained centres of religious life and agricultural management. This dual identity defined Ptolemaic Egypt. On one side stood the Greek elite, clustered in Alexandria, benefiting from royal patronage and participating in Mediterranean trade. On the other stood the native Egyptian population, deeply tied to the rhythms of the Nile and long-standing temple networks. The Ptolemies invested heavily in Alexandria. The city became home to the Mouseion, an institution dedicated to scholarship, and the famous Library of Alexandria, which sought to collect knowledge from across the known world. Scholars studied mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and literature. Greek intellectual life flourished on Egyptian soil. At the same time, the Ptolemies supported Egyptian temples, funding construction projects and presenting themselves as legitimate pharaohs. Reliefs carved into temple walls show Ptolemaic kings offering gifts to Egyptian gods, wearing the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. These images were essential. They signalled continuity. They reassured the priesthood that the divine order remained intact, even under foreign leadership. Yet beneath this carefully balanced surface lay tension. The Ptolemaic dynasty was marked by internal conflict. Brothers competed against sisters, mothers plotted against sons, civil wars erupted within the royal family. The tradition of sibling marriage, borrowed in part from Egyptian royal precedent but intensified under Greek rule, concentrated power but also intensified rivalry. Economic strain added further pressure. The Ptolemies controlled vast agricultural resources, Egypt's grain was among the most valuable commodities in the Mediterranean. The state maintained strict control over production and taxation. Bureaucrats recorded harvests, levied taxes, and monitored trade. This centralised system generated immense wealth for the crown, but also placed heavy burdens on the population. Over time, resentment simmered in parts of the countryside. There were revolts, particularly in Upper Egypt. Native Egyptian leaders occasionally attempted to assert independence. Although most uprisings were suppressed, they revealed cracks in the Ptolemaic system. As generations passed, the dynasty became increasingly entangled with the politics of the wider Hellenistic world. Alliances were forged through marriage. Wars were fought against rival kingdoms such as the Seleucids. Naval power played a significant role in maintaining influence across the eastern Mediterranean. Meanwhile, a new power was rising in the west. Rome, initially one of many states competing for influence, gradually expanded its reach. By the 2nd century BCE, Rome had defeated Carthage and asserted dominance across much of the Mediterranean basin. Its armies were disciplined, its political system flexible, and its ambitions persistent. The Ptolemaic rulers could not ignore Rome. Diplomatic missions were sent. Gifts were exchanged. At times, Roman intervention helped secure the throne for one claimant over another. Each intervention strengthened Rome's leverage. By the 1st century BCE, Egypt's independence existed in name but was increasingly dependent on Roman goodwill. The Ptolemies borrowed heavily. They promised support. They aligned themselves with Roman factions. This relationship was both protective and dangerous. When Cleopatra was born in 69 BCE, she inherited not only a throne but a complex inheritance shaped by 3 centuries of Greek rule layered atop thousands of years of Egyptian tradition. Her kingdom was wealthy, cultured, and strategically vital. It was also vulnerable. Alexandria, her birthplace, embodied this vulnerability and strength at once. The city was a masterpiece of Hellenistic urban planning. The Pharos Lighthouse, one of the tallest structures of the ancient world, guided ships safely into harbour. Warehouses stored grain destined for foreign markets. Philosophers debated in shaded courtyards. Greek dramas were performed in theatres. At the same time, Egyptian temples stood not far away, their rituals continuing as they had for generations. Cleopatra grew up in this layered environment. She would have heard Greek spoken in the palace and Egyptian spoken in the streets. She would have understood that her family's claim to rule rested partly on tradition and partly on Roman recognition. The shadow of Greece over Egypt was not merely cultural, it was structural. The administrative system was Hellenistic in design. The army included Greek and Macedonian elements. Coins bore Greek inscriptions. Even the concept of monarchy as practiced by the Ptolemies reflected the influence of Alexander's successors, yet Cleopatra would become notable for stepping beyond some of these limitations. Unlike many of her predecessors, she reportedly learned the Egyptian language. She presented herself not only as a Greek queen, but as a pharaoh in the fullest sense. She understood that legitimacy in Egypt required more than lineage. It required visible participation in religious and cultural life. By the time she ascended to the throne alongside her brother, the balance between Greek heritage and Egyptian identity was delicate. Rome loomed nearby, observing. The Mediterranean world was shifting from a network of Hellenistic kingdoms toward Roman consolidation. Egypt stood at a crossroads. It was wealthy enough to matter. It was ancient enough to command respect. It was divided enough to be exploited. The generations before Cleopatra had navigated this terrain with varying success. Some had strengthened the kingdom, others had weakened it through internal conflict. The treasury had been drained more than once to secure Roman favour. Civil unrest had flared and been suppressed. Cleopatra would inherit not a stable golden age, but a kingdom that required careful management. The shadow of Greece had reshaped Egypt's ruling class. The shadow of Rome now threatened to absorb it entirely. As the Ptolemaic dynasty entered its final decades, The pressures that had been building for centuries converged. Family rivalries sharpened. Roman generals gained influence. Economic challenges persisted. The young princess growing up in Alexandria absorbed all of this, aware that her future would unfold within these constraints. The story of Cleopatra cannot be separated from this long transformation. She did not appear suddenly in an untouched Egypt. She emerged from a dynasty created by conquest, sustained by adaptation, and challenged by shifting global power. The centuries of Greek rule had created a hybrid state, neither fully Egyptian in its leadership nor entirely Greek in its population. This hybrid identity was both strength and weakness. It allowed Egypt to connect with the wider Mediterranean world. It also left it dependent on alliances that could quickly become entanglements. Cleopatra's rise would be shaped by this inheritance. Her strategies, her alliances, and her presentation of herself as queen were responses to the world the Ptolemies had built. The sands of the Nile carried memories older than any Greek dynasty, yet the palace in which she learned the art of rule stood firmly within the Hellenistic tradition. As Rome's internal conflicts intensified and Egypt's internal divisions deepened, the stage was set for a young ruler who would attempt to hold these worlds together. The shadow of Greece still stretched across Egypt, but another shadow was approaching from the west, and Cleopatra would soon find herself navigating both at once. When Cleopatra was born into the Ptolemaic household, she entered a dynasty already old by Hellenistic standards, and yet still foreign in the land it ruled. For nearly 3 centuries, her ancestors had governed Egypt from Alexandria, presenting themselves as pharaohs while remaining, in origin and identity, Macedonian Greeks. The story of her reign cannot be separated from the peculiar structure of this royal family, a line shaped by conquest, sustained by careful adaptation, and weakened over time by rivalry within its own walls. The Ptolemaic dynasty began not as an Egyptian continuation, but as the inheritance of a general. Ptolemy, son of Lagus, had served under Alexander the Great. When Alexander's empire fragmented after his death, Ptolemy moved quickly. He secured Egypt as his territory, understanding both its wealth and its defensibility. Protected by deserts and the Nile, Egypt was easier to hold than many of the territories contested by rival generals. Ptolemy I ruled with a practical understanding of legitimacy. He did not attempt to erase Egyptian tradition. Instead, he layered Greek governance atop it. He founded institutions in Alexandria that reflected Hellenistic culture, while supporting temple construction and religious rituals throughout the countryside. In Egyptian art, he appeared as a traditional pharaoh, making offerings to ancient gods. In Greek inscriptions, he was a Macedonian king among successors of Alexander. This dual presentation was deliberate. The Ptolemies ruled 2 audiences. The Greek elite required recognition of their Hellenistic identity. The Egyptian priesthood required continuity of sacred kingship. Balancing these demands became a defining feature of the dynasty. As generations passed, the family strengthened its claim to Egypt through symbolic gestures. The cult of Alexander was promoted. Royal siblings married one another, echoing both Egyptian and Hellenistic precedents for divine kingship. Brother and sister unions were presented as expressions of royal purity and continuity. In practice, they intensified internal competition. The early Ptolemies were energetic rulers. Ptolemy II expanded the navy, supported trade, and fostered scholarship in Alexandria. The city flourished as a centre of commerce and learning. Ships carried grain, papyrus, glass, and textiles across the Mediterranean. The Library of Alexandria grew into a symbol of intellectual ambition. Scholars such as Euclid and Eratosthenes worked under royal patronage. Yet expansion required military strength. The Ptolemies engaged in a series of conflicts known as the Syrian Wars, fighting the Seleucid Empire for control of territories in the eastern Mediterranean. These wars were costly. Victories brought prestige, but losses strained resources. Over time, the balance shifted. The Ptolemaic navy, once dominant, faced increasing challenges. Within the palace, succession disputes became common. When a king died, questions of illegitimacy often surfaced immediately. Mothers acted as regents for young sons. Brothers plotted against brothers. Queens manoeuvred to secure influence. Assassination and exile were not rare occurrences. One pattern became particularly pronounced: the weakening of central authority through internal division. While the early Ptolemies had projected confidence, later generations struggled to maintain cohesion. Rival claimants invited foreign intervention to strengthen their position. Rome, initially a distant observer, began to play a decisive role in determining which Ptolemy would rule. The relationship with Rome evolved gradually. During the 2nd century BCE, Rome's influence expanded after victories against other Hellenistic kingdoms. Egyptian rulers sent embassies, gifts, and tributes. Roman senators increasingly viewed Egypt as both a valuable ally and a potential acquisition. The Ptolemaic economy was highly organized. The state maintained tight control over agriculture. Farmers along the Nile worked land whose productivity depended on annual flooding. Bureaucrats recorded yields, assessed taxes, and enforced quotas. The crown claimed monopolies over key commodities such as papyrus and certain oils. This centralized system generated revenue but also created resentment. Native Egyptian revolts erupted at intervals, particularly in Upper Egypt. Local leaders declared themselves pharaoh in defiance of Alexandria. Although most uprisings were suppressed, they exposed the fragility of Ptolemaic authority outside major urban centers. Religious policy remained central to maintaining stability. The Ptolemies sponsored temple construction at Edfu, Dendera, and other sites. Reliefs depict them in traditional regalia, interacting with gods according to ancient formulas. This investment in religious architecture was not purely devotional. It reinforced the perception that divine order continued uninterrupted under Greek rule. By the time Ptolemy XII Auletes, Cleopatra's father, ascended the throne, the dynasty had already begun to decline in strength. Auletes' epithet, meaning the flute player, reflected criticism from contemporaries who considered him less formidable than earlier kings. He faced both domestic unrest and external pressure. His position depended heavily on Roman recognition. To secure his rule, Auletes paid substantial sums to influential Romans. He borrowed extensively, placing strain on Egypt's finances. When unrest forced him to flee temporarily, he sought refuge in Rome. Roman military assistance restored him to power, but at the cost of deeper dependence. Cleopatra grew up observing this pattern. She saw that her father's authority was not absolute. It required negotiation with Roman leaders whose ambitions extended far beyond Egypt. She learned that maintaining the throne involved diplomacy as much as tradition. The Ptolemaic court itself was a place of ceremony and calculation. Greek remained the language of administration. The elite attended philosophical discussions, artistic performances, and political assemblies. At the same time, rituals tied the monarchy to Egyptian deities. The ruler was both a Hellenistic monarch and a divine pharaoh. Family life within this environment was rarely peaceful. Cleopatra had siblings who were not merely relatives but potential rivals. According to custom, she would be expected to share the throne with one of her brothers. Marriage between them would solidify their joint claim. Yet history suggested that such arrangements often ended in betrayal. The dynasty's approach to marriage had long been controversial outside Egypt. Greek observers were uncomfortable with sibling unions, even though royal precedent in Egypt provided justification. Within the Ptolemaic family, these marriages were intended to prevent external alliances that might dilute royal authority. Instead, they often concentrated hostility within the household. As the dynasty aged, the charisma and administrative skill of its rulers varied. Some kings were effective administrators, others were distracted by luxury or weakened by factionalism. The perception of decline grew stronger in Roman eyes. Egypt remained wealthy, but its rulers appeared less capable of independent action. By Cleopatra's youth, the Mediterranean political landscape had shifted dramatically. Rome's civil conflicts created both danger and opportunity. Ambitious Roman generals sought wealth and prestige. Egypt's grain supply made it strategically indispensable. Any Roman leader who controlled Egypt would hold significant leverage. The Ptolemaic dynasty thus existed in a state of tension. It possessed immense cultural prestige and economic resources. It also faced internal fragmentation and external scrutiny. Its rulers walked a narrow path between asserting sovereignty and appeasing Rome. Cleopatra inherited this precarious structure. Her claim to rule rested on a lineage that traced back to Alexander's general. Her authority depended on the continued acceptance of Egyptian priests, Greek elites, and Roman officials. Her education prepared her for this complexity. She understood that ruling Egypt meant addressing multiple audiences at once. The identity of the Ptolemaic dynasty remained layered until its final years. Coins bore Greek inscriptions. Temple walls depicted Egyptian iconography. Royal ceremonies blended traditions. This fusion was not accidental. It was the foundation upon which the dynasty had survived. Yet fusion did not eliminate friction. Greek settlers often occupied privileged positions. Native Egyptians sometimes experienced heavier taxation. Social divisions persisted. Over centuries, these divisions shaped the kingdom's internal dynamics. When Cleopatra became co-ruler in 51 BCE, she stepped into a family tradition defined by both grandeur and instability. The palace had seen generations of ambition and betrayal. Alliances shifted rapidly. Roman envoys observed closely. The treasury required careful management. Public loyalty could not be assumed. The Ptolemaic dynasty's survival had depended on adaptability. Cleopatra would push that adaptability further than her predecessors. She would learn from their mistakes and their strategies alike. She would embrace Egyptian symbolism more fully than many before her. She would engage directly with Rome's most powerful men. The Greek family that had once seized Egypt through the ambitions of a general now approached its final act. The institutions they built, the hybrid culture they fostered, and the conflicts they endured all formed the world Cleopatra inherited. As she matured within this environment, she understood that her dynasty's history was both a resource and a warning. Its early strength showed what could be achieved through careful balance. Its later weaknesses demonstrated how quickly internal division could invite foreign control. The throne she would fight to secure was not simply a seat of power. It was the culmination of 3 centuries of negotiation between Greek heritage and Egyptian tradition, between independence and dependence, between ambition and vulnerability, with the dynasty's past behind her and Rome's growing power before her. Cleopatra prepared to step into a role that would test every lesson her family's history had taught. Before Cleopatra ever stood before Roman generals or addressed the priests of Egypt in formal ceremony, she was a child growing up within the structured yet volatile world of the Alexandrian court. Her earliest years unfolded inside a palace that overlooked one of the busiest harbours in the Mediterranean, in a city that was neither entirely Greek nor entirely Egyptian, but something carefully constructed between the two. Alexandria was not an accidental capital. It had been designed to project power, intellect, and order. It was the heart of the Ptolemaic kingdom, and it became the classroom in which Cleopatra was shaped. Unlike many royal children whose education remained narrow and ceremonial, Cleopatra's upbringing appears to have been unusually broad. The Ptolemaic dynasty valued Greek intellectual traditions. Scholarship, rhetoric, philosophy, and mathematics were not abstract pursuits in Alexandria. They were woven into the identity of the ruling class. The legacy of the Great Library and the Museion still lingered, even if both had passed their peak. Teachers trained in the Hellenistic tradition were available to instruct royal children. Cleopatra would have been immersed in this environment from an early age. Greek was the language of administration and elite culture. It was the language of Homer, Plato, and Aristotle. It was also the language in which treaties were written and official decrees recorded. Cleopatra mastered Greek as her primary tongue, yet what distinguished her from many of her predecessors was her reported command of additional languages. Ancient sources suggest that she learned Egyptian, a significant departure from earlier Ptolemaic rulers who relied on interpreters when communicating with their subjects outside Alexandria. This decision was not merely practical, it was political. To speak Egyptian was to signal respect for the land she ruled. It allowed her to address priests and officials without mediation. It bridged the distance that had long existed between the Greek-speaking court and the native population. Cleopatra's linguistic ability became part of her reputation. She was said to converse directly with diplomats from various regions, adapting to their language rather than forcing them to adapt to hers. Her education likely included rhetoric, the art of persuasive speech. In a court defined by negotiation and rivalry, the ability to speak clearly and convincingly mattered. The Hellenistic world valued debate and philosophical inquiry. Cleopatra would have studied texts that explored ethics, governance, and the nature of power. She would have encountered ideas about kingship that differed from purely Egyptian traditions. Greek philosophy emphasized reason, strategy, and civic order. Egyptian tradition emphasized divine kingship and ritual continuity. Cleopatra grew up at the intersection of these perspectives. Mathematics and astronomy also formed part of elite education. Alexandria had been home to scholars who measured the circumference of the Earth and mapped the stars. Although the height of that intellectual activity had occurred generations earlier, the culture of inquiry persisted. Understanding astronomy had practical value in Egypt, where the Nile's flooding and agricultural cycles were closely linked to celestial observation. A ruler who grasped these systems was better positioned to manage resources and reassure the priesthood. Cleopatra's tutors likely included both Greek scholars and Egyptian advisors. This dual instruction reinforced the hybrid identity of the kingdom. She learned to navigate two cultural systems simultaneously. She studied the myths of the Greek pantheon alongside the complex theology of Egyptian deities. She understood the symbolism of Isis and Osiris, the rituals of temple life, and the importance of public ceremonies in reinforcing legitimacy. Beyond formal subjects, Cleopatra's education included observation. The Alexandrian court was not a quiet place. Diplomats arrived regularly. Roman envoys negotiated financial arrangements. Military officers reported on regional stability. Cleopatra witnessed her father's reliance on Roman support. She saw how quickly alliances shifted. She learned that authority required constant attention. Her father, Ptolemy XII, or Leets, was not universally admired. His dependence on Rome and his lavish spending drew criticism, yet his survival required careful diplomacy. Cleopatra watched these interactions closely. Even as a child, she would have sensed that Egypt's future depended not only on internal stability, but on external relationships. The palace environment demanded resilience. Rivalry among siblings was expected. Cleopatra had sisters and brothers, each of whom possessed potential claims to the throne. In such a setting, education extended beyond books and scrolls. It included learning whom to trust, how to maintain composure, and when to speak carefully. Physical training likely complemented intellectual study. Royal children were expected to present themselves confidently. Appearances mattered. Ceremony required discipline. Cleopatra would have learned how to conduct herself during religious festivals, diplomatic receptions, and formal audiences. Alexandria itself offered daily lessons. The harbour bustled with merchants from Rome, Greece, Judea, and North Africa. Markets displayed goods from distant lands. The city's architecture reflected deliberate planning, with wide avenues and monumental buildings. Exposure to this diversity reinforced Cleopatra's awareness that Egypt was part of a wider Mediterranean network. Religion remained central to her identity. As a future pharaoh, Cleopatra would be expected to embody divine authority. Egyptian theology framed the ruler as an intermediary between gods and people. Ritual precision was essential. She would have been trained in the proper gestures, offerings, and symbolic roles required during temple ceremonies. These practices were not ornamental. They affirmed cosmic order in the eyes of the population. At the same time, the Greek tradition viewed kingship through a different lens. Hellenistic rulers styled themselves as benefactors and patrons of culture. They funded public works and encouraged scholarship. Cleopatra inherited this expectation as well. Her education prepared her to engage with intellectuals and project refinement. One notable aspect of her upbringing was exposure to political instability. When her father was forced into exile due to unrest, Cleopatra was still young. The experience left a clear impression. She saw how quickly power could collapse. She saw how Roman backing restored her father. This episode likely sharpened her understanding of vulnerability and opportunity. Unlike rulers who inherited stable systems, Cleopatra matured during uncertainty. Her education therefore included adaptability. She learned that loyalty could shift. She learned that authority must be asserted visibly. She observed the consequences of indecision. Cleopatra's reported charisma did not emerge from isolation. It was cultivated in a court that valued presentation and persuasion. She learned how to command attention without raising her voice. She learned how to frame arguments in ways that appealed to different audiences. Historical accounts often emphasize her beauty, yet contemporary descriptions suggest that her intelligence and presence made a stronger impression than physical appearance alone. Education played a central role in shaping that presence. She was comfortable discussing policy, culture, and philosophy. She could engage foreign leaders without hesitation. Her familiarity with Egyptian language and customs gave her an advantage over predecessors who remained culturally distant from their subjects. By speaking directly to Egyptian priests, she strengthened ties that had sometimes weakened under previous rulers. This choice reflected both personal aptitude and strategic awareness. Cleopatra's adolescence likely involved increasing participation in state affairs. Royal daughters were not sheltered from governance. She would have attended councils, observed financial discussions, and listened as military matters were debated. This exposure prepared her for eventual co-rule with her younger brother. The Ptolemaic tradition of sibling marriage meant that her future partnership would be politically charged from the outset. Education prepared her to anticipate conflict. She understood the precedent of rivalry within her family. She knew that shared rule often became contested rule. By the time she reached her late teens, Cleopatra was more than a ceremonial princess. She possessed linguistic skill, intellectual training, and first-hand political awareness. Alexandria had provided her with resources unavailable in many other capitals. It had also exposed her to the pressures of an increasingly Roman-dominated world. The environment that shaped her was complex and demanding. It required balancing Greek heritage with Egyptian legitimacy. It required understanding that Rome's approval could determine survival. It required projecting authority even when circumstances were uncertain. Cleopatra's unusual education did not guarantee success, but it gave her tools. She learned to read people as carefully as she read texts. She learned that words could shift outcomes. She learned that symbols carried weight. When her father died in 51 BCE, leaving her to rule jointly with her brother, Cleopatra did not enter governance unprepared. She stepped forward with a background that combined scholarship and strategy. The lessons of Alexandria, absorbed from tutors and from experience, positioned her to act decisively. Yet education alone could not prevent conflict. The co-rule arrangement quickly deteriorated. Advisors around her brother sought to limit her influence. The tension that would soon force her into exile was already forming within palace corridors. Cleopatra's intellectual preparation would soon be tested not in debate halls, but in the harsher arena of political survival. When Ptolemy XII died in 51 BCE, Cleopatra was about 18 years old. According to his will, she and her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, were to rule jointly. The arrangement followed long-standing Ptolemaic custom. A brother and sister would share the throne, present themselves as partners in rule, and in theory marry to consolidate their authority. On papyrus and informal decrees, the system appeared orderly. In practice, it often led to tension. Cleopatra had grown up watching the fragile nature of power in her family. She knew that co-rule rarely meant equal influence. She also understood that a younger sibling, guided by ambitious advisors, could become a focal point for opposition. Her brother was only around 10 years old when their father died. His youth made him dependent on regents and court officials. That dependence created opportunity for others to act in his name. At first, official documents placed Cleopatra's name prominently alongside her brother's. Coins were minted bearing her image. Decrees were issued in their joint authority. Yet within months, signs of division appeared. Powerful figures within the court, including the eunuch Pothinus and the general Achilles, began consolidating control around the young king. Their interests did not necessarily align with Cleopatra's. The palace in Alexandria was no stranger to intrigue. Rivalries had shaped earlier generations. Cleopatra would have recognized familiar patterns. Advisors close to Ptolemy XIII likely viewed her independence and intelligence as a threat. A capable co-ruler was less useful to them than a pliable boy king. As Cleopatra asserted herself, resistance hardened. Tensions escalated quietly at first. Administrative decisions became contested. Access to the treasury and military resources became points of friction. The question was not simply who wore the crown, but who controlled the levers of power beneath it. Cleopatra attempted to act decisively. Early in the co-rule period, official records show her issuing decrees without her brother's name, suggesting she was trying to govern independently. This move may have been intended to establish her authority clearly. It also may have accelerated the opposition against her. The advisors around Ptolemy XIII moved quickly. By 49 BCE, Cleopatra found herself increasingly isolated in Alexandria. Court factions solidified. Propaganda framed her as overreaching. The machinery of governance shifted away from her influence. Eventually, Cleopatra was forced to leave the capital. The details of her departure are not fully preserved, but the outcome is clear. She withdrew from Alexandria and sought support elsewhere. For a young queen raised to believe in her dynastic right, exile was both a personal and political blow. Her first experience of rivalry within her own family confirmed what history had already shown. The Ptolemaic system encouraged conflict. Siblings were not merely relatives, they were competitors. Each possessed potential legitimacy. Each could be used as a symbol by competing factions. Cleopatra did not disappear into obscurity during her exile. She began gathering allies in the eastern regions of Egypt, and possibly in neighbouring territories. She sought to build a military force capable of challenging her brother's regime. This decision demonstrated her refusal to accept removal quietly. She understood that survival required action. Meanwhile, Alexandria remained under the control of Ptolemy XIII's advisors. They maintained the appearance of stability, but Egypt's broader situation was far from calm. The Nile's flooding had been inconsistent in recent years, affecting agricultural output. Economic pressure persisted. Rome's civil conflict was intensifying, and its ripple effects would soon reach Egypt. The sibling rivalry between Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII did not exist in isolation. It intersected with Rome's power struggle between Julius Caesar and Pompey. As these Roman leaders manoeuvred against each other, Egypt's strategic importance grew. Grain shipments from the Nile were critical to Rome's population. Control over Egypt could influence the outcome of Rome's internal war. In 48 BCE, after suffering defeat by Caesar, Pompey fled to Egypt seeking refuge. The advisors controlling Ptolemy XIII faced a decision. They could shelter Pompey and risk angering Caesar, or they could attempt to curry favour with the likely victor. They chose the latter. Pompey was assassinated upon arrival, and his severed head was presented to Caesar. The decision backfired. Caesar reportedly reacted with disgust rather than gratitude. Instead of earning his favour, the act complicated Egypt's position. Caesar soon arrived in Alexandria, bringing Roman military presence directly into the sibling conflict. For Cleopatra, this development presented both risk and opportunity. She was still outside the capital, gathering support. Caesar's arrival meant that Rome's most powerful figure was now physically present in her kingdom. If she could secure his backing, she could regain her throne. Accounts describe her dramatic re-entry into Alexandria to meet Caesar privately. Whether she was smuggled in, wrapped in bedding, or carried in a sack, the symbolism endured. She took a calculated risk, placing herself before Caesar not as a defeated exile, but as a legitimate ruler seeking arbitration. Her appeal to Caesar was strategic. She framed the dispute as a matter of rightful succession under her father's will. Caesar, already committed to asserting Roman authority in the region, saw advantage in supporting her. The alliance shifted the balance within the palace. Fighting broke out between Caesar's forces and those loyal to Ptolemy XIII. The conflict, known as the Alexandrian War, engulfed parts of the city. Cleopatra's rivalry with her brother escalated into open warfare. The young king's advisors attempted to use Egypt's resources against Roman intervention. The war ended with Ptolemy XIII's death, reportedly by drowning in the Nile while fleeing battle. Cleopatra was restored to power, though formally she now shared the throne with another younger brother, Ptolemy XIV. The pattern repeated, yet this time her position was far stronger. Caesar's backing secured her authority. The rivalry with her first co-ruler left a lasting impression. Cleopatra had experienced betrayal from within her own household. She had learned that legitimacy required more than birthright. It required alliances capable of countering internal opposition. Her approach to governance after regaining power reflected this lesson. She strengthened ties with Rome, recognizing that Egypt's independence depended on calculated partnerships. She also reinforced her connection to Egyptian religious traditions, presenting herself as a capable pharaoh in temple reliefs and public ceremonies. The conflict with Ptolemy XIII was not simply a sibling dispute. It revealed structural weaknesses within the Ptolemaic system. Shared rule was unstable when real authority was contested. Advisors could manipulate youthful kings. Rivalry could escalate quickly when external powers became involved. Cleopatra's survival marked her transition from princess to hardened ruler. Exile and return had reshaped her perspective. She no longer operated under assumptions of secure inheritance. She understood that power could be taken as easily as it was granted. The experience also sharpened her diplomatic instincts. Her ability to secure Caesar's support demonstrated strategic awareness. She recognized the value of timing. She acted when Rome's internal war created leverage. After the Alexandrian War, Cleopatra's authority was more consolidated than before. Yet the broader Mediterranean remained volatile. Caesar's dominance in Rome was not universally accepted. Political tensions simmered beneath apparent stability. Cleopatra's early rivalry within her own family prepared her for the larger contests ahead. She had already navigated palace intrigue, military confrontation, and foreign negotiation. These experiences would inform her later alliance with Mark Antony and her confrontation with Octavian. For now, she stood restored in Alexandria, ruling alongside a younger brother whose role was largely ceremonial. The palace that had once expelled her now recognized her supremacy. The first taste of rivalry had ended in her favour, but it had also demonstrated how precarious the throne remained. The lessons learned during those years of tension would remain with her. Authority required vigilance. Family ties offered no guarantee of loyalty. External powers could both threaten and protect. Cleopatra would carry these understandings forward as Rome's next wave of conflict began to gather strength beyond Egypt's shores. Cleopatra's removal from Alexandria did not come with ceremony. There was no formal abdication, No graceful retreat announced in the public squares. Instead, her authority narrowed quietly, her access restricted, her supporters edged aside until remaining in the capital became impossible. The young queen who had once appeared on official decrees now found herself displaced by her own brother's court. Around her, decisions were made in the name of Ptolemy XIII, but the guiding hands belonged to his advisors. Leaving Alexandria meant more than stepping beyond palace walls. It meant abandoning the centre of administration, the treasury, the navy, and the symbolic heart of the Ptolemaic state. The harbour, once visible from her chambers, now lay behind her. The city that had shaped her education and identity was no longer under her control. For a ruler raised to see herself as legitimate heir, exile was a harsh confirmation that inheritance alone could not secure obedience. Cleopatra did not flee blindly. The eastern regions of Egypt, closer to the Sinai and the Levant, offered distance from her brother's immediate reach. The desert, often imagined as empty, was in reality threaded with caravan routes and garrison towns. She likely moved toward territories where loyalty could be negotiated, and where Greek settlers, mercenaries, or regional leaders might be persuaded to support her cause. Exile forced a shift in perspective. Within the palace, she had operated inside layers of ceremony and hierarchy. Outside it, she faced practical constraints. Resources had to be gathered, supplies secured, allies convinced. A claimant without visible strength could quickly be dismissed. Cleopatra needed to transform her position from displaced ruler to credible challenger. Her first taste of open vulnerability likely sharpened her resolve. The desert regions bordering Egypt were not hospitable landscapes. Heat pressed down during the day. Sandstorms could reduce visibility to nothing. Yet these spaces were also protective. They offered room to regroup away from Alexandria's immediate political pressure. Cleopatra's upbringing had prepared her intellectually, but exile demanded endurance. She had to demonstrate to potential supporters that she was not defeated. Messages would have been sent to influential figures, emphasizing her legitimacy under her father's will. She would have framed her removal as an unlawful seizure of authority by manipulative advisors acting through a minor king. The Ptolemaic dynasty's history of internal conflict meant that her appeal was not unprecedented. Rival claimants had risen before. The difference now lay in timing. Rome's civil war between Julius Caesar and Pompey was unfolding. The Mediterranean's balance of power was unstable. Egypt's internal division was not occurring in isolation. Cleopatra's exile coincided with economic strain. Irregular Nile flooding had affected harvests. Grain supplies, critical to both domestic stability and foreign trade, were under pressure. A divided leadership risked compounding these challenges. Cleopatra could argue that decisive rule was necessary to maintain order. Gathering a force required both money and loyalty. The Ptolemaic state had long employed mercenaries. Greek and other foreign soldiers had settled in Egypt generations earlier, granted land in exchange for service. Some of these communities may have viewed Cleopatra as a legitimate sovereign worth backing. Others would have calculated their position carefully. Exile also meant confronting isolation. Cleopatra had been raised within networks of advisors and tutors. Now each conversation carried weight. Trust had to be assessed quickly. A misjudgment could mean betrayal or capture. The advisors surrounding her brother would have preferred a quiet resolution. Removing her entirely would eliminate future claims. The desert years were brief in duration but significant in effect. Cleopatra learned how quickly alliances could dissolve. She experienced firsthand the fragility of status. Titles meant little without control over forces capable of enforcing them. While Cleopatra gathered support, events in Rome accelerated. Caesar defeated Pompey at the Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BCE. Pompey fled eastward, seeking refuge. His arrival in Egypt forced the Alexandrian court to make a dangerous choice. The decision to execute him and present his remains to Caesar revealed both opportunism and miscalculation. Cleopatra, still in exile, would have recognized the implications immediately. Caesar's arrival in Alexandria meant that Roman power would directly intersect with Egypt's internal struggle. If she could position herself as the rightful ruler, aligned with Caesar's interests, her prospects would improve dramatically. Exile thus became a period of preparation. Cleopatra was no longer reacting solely to palace intrigue. She was evaluating the broader Mediterranean context. Her education had emphasized language, rhetoric, and strategy. Now she applied those lessons under pressure. Life away from Alexandria may have exposed her to regions of Egypt less influenced by Greek culture. Interaction with local communities would have reinforced the importance of her ability to speak Egyptian. Presenting herself as a legitimate pharaoh to priests and regional officials strengthened her claim beyond Hellenistic elites. The symbolism of exile also shaped her narrative. A queen unjustly cast out by manipulative advisors could evoke sympathy. A ruler willing to endure hardship rather than submit quietly could command respect. Cleopatra's return would later be framed not simply as restoration, but as correction of imbalance. Exile was not passive waiting. She moved deliberately. Historical evidence suggests that she assembled troops near the eastern frontier, possibly near Pelusium. That location, strategically significant as a gateway between Egypt and the Levant, positioned her to re-enter the political arena when opportunity arose. Meanwhile, Caesar entered Alexandria with a limited but disciplined force. He sought to stabilize the region while pursuing his own objectives in the Roman Civil War. The execution of Pompey complicated his position. Egypt's leadership dispute became entangled with Roman authority. Cleopatra's decision to approach Caesar directly required courage and calculation. Remaining in exile while her brother consolidated power risked permanent marginalization. Acting swiftly could restore her influence. The dramatic account of her smuggling herself into the palace to meet Caesar may contain embellishment, but the essence reflects her willingness to take bold action. Her time in exile had prepared her for this moment. She had learned that survival required initiative. She understood that appealing to Caesar meant framing her cause in terms he would recognize. She presented herself not as a rebel, but as co-ruler seeking enforcement of her father's will. The desert had tested her resilience. It had stripped away assumptions of security. It had forced her to build support rather than inherit it. When she stood before Caesar, she did so as someone who had already confronted displacement and adapted. Exile also altered her relationship with power. Having lost direct control once, she would be less inclined to share it casually again. The experience reinforced the need for decisive alliances and visible authority. The young queen cast out into the desert did not retreat into obscurity. She returned with renewed purpose, aligning her personal struggle with the larger currents shaping the Mediterranean. Her rivalry with her brother would escalate into open conflict, but exile had given her clarity about the stakes. The sands that once marked her separation from Alexandria would soon mark the path of armies. Caesar's involvement would tip the balance. Cleopatra's re-entry into the capital would not be a quiet restoration, but the beginning of a new phase in her rule. The period of exile, though brief, became a defining chapter in her early life. It transformed a co-ruler overshadowed by advisors into a contender willing to reshape events. It demonstrated that she would not accept displacement as final. As she prepared to confront her brother's regime with Roman backing, the lessons of the desert remained with her. Authority had to be defended, alliances had to be secured, timing had to be precise. Her return to Alexandria would soon draw Egypt fully into Rome's internal war, binding her fate to Caesar's and setting in motion consequences that neither she nor her brother could entirely foresee. In the autumn of 48 BCE, the Mediterranean world narrowed its focus toward Alexandria. Julius Caesar, fresh from victory at Pharsalus against Pompey, pursued his defeated rival across the sea. Pompey's flight ended not in Rome nor in Greece, but at the mouth of the Nile. He believed Egypt might offer refuge. Instead, he encountered calculation. When Pompey arrived near Pelusium, representatives of Ptolemy XIII approached him with promises of welcome. The young king's advisors, chiefly Pothinus and Achillas, had already weighed their options. Caesar had won a decisive battle. Pompey, though once powerful, was now a liability. Seeking favour with Caesar, they arranged Pompey's assassination before he could even set foot on Egyptian soil. Pompey was stabbed in a small boat and beheaded. His remains were presented to Caesar upon his arrival in Alexandria. The gesture was meant as tribute. It misjudged the man it sought to impress. Caesar reportedly turned away in anger. He had pursued Pompey as a rival, not as prey to be slaughtered without dignity. The murder did not inspire gratitude. It underscored instability. Caesar entered Alexandria not as a distant observer, but as a Roman consul and military commander with immediate interests. He brought with him a relatively small force, hardened veterans of the Gallic campaigns and recent civil war. His presence shifted the political landscape instantly. Egypt was no longer managing its internal dispute alone. Rome's authority had arrived in person. At that moment, Cleopatra was still outside the capital, gathering support after her exile. Her brother remained in control of Alexandria through his advisors. Caesar declared that he would arbitrate the dispute between the siblings according to their father's will, which had named them co-rulers. This announcement challenged the authority of those who had pushed Cleopatra aside. The palace became the focal point of negotiation. Caesar established quarters within the royal compound. Ptolemy XIII and his advisors attempted to maintain composure, but tension ran beneath every exchange. Roman soldiers moved through the city. Alexandrian citizens watched carefully. The situation was volatile. Cleopatra understood that delay favoured her opponents. She needed direct access to Caesar. Ancient accounts describe her arranging to be smuggled into the palace, concealed within bedding or a sack. Whether every detail is accurate remains uncertain, yet the act reflects her willingness to seize initiative. She did not wait for permission. She placed herself before Caesar in private audience. The meeting was decisive. Cleopatra presented her case as rightful heir, displaced by manipulation rather than law. She emphasized the legitimacy of her father's will. She framed her appeal not as rebellion, but as restoration of order. Caesar, already displeased by Pompey's murder and aware of Egypt's strategic importance, saw advantage in supporting her. For Caesar, Egypt represented more than a family dispute. It was a wealthy kingdom with control over grain supplies vital to Rome. Stability there mattered. Aligning with Cleopatra offered a partner who was educated, politically aware, and capable of cooperation. Backing her also allowed Caesar to assert Roman authority without annexation. Ptolemy XIII's advisors reacted quickly. They rallied forces within Alexandria. Achillas commanded troops loyal to the young king. What began as arbitration turned into confrontation. The Alexandrian War erupted around the palace and harbour. Caesar's position was precarious. He had only a few thousand soldiers. The city was large and densely populated. Supply lines were vulnerable. Fighting spread through narrow streets. Fires broke out. Some accounts suggest that parts of the Great Library may have been damaged during the chaos, though the extent remains debated. Cleopatra remained within the palace complex during much of the fighting. Her presence there symbolized partnership with Caesar. The alliance between them extended beyond politics. It became personal. Ancient writers would later emphasize romance and spectacle, but the immediate reality was military necessity. The Nile Delta became a battleground. Reinforcements from neighbouring regions were summoned. Caesar held the palace quarter while awaiting support from allied forces. Naval engagements occurred in the harbour. Alexandria, once a centre of commerce and scholarship, became a contested zone. For Cleopatra, this was a second confrontation with her brother, but on a far larger stage. Exile had taught her caution. Now she saw firsthand how Roman intervention could determine outcomes. Her future was bound to Caesar's success. In early 47 BCE, reinforcements arrived for Caesar. The balance shifted. Ptolemy XIII fled the city but was reportedly drowned in the Nile while retreating. With his death, the immediate challenge to Cleopatra's authority ended. Caesar declared Cleopatra and her younger brother Ptolemy XIV co-rulers, maintaining the appearance of dynastic continuity. In reality, Cleopatra held dominant influence. Caesar remained in Egypt for several months after the conflict, consolidating his position. During this period, Cleopatra bore a son, Ptolemy XV, Philopator Caesar, known commonly as Caesarion. The child's existence strengthened her link to Rome's most powerful figure. While Caesar never formally acknowledged Caesarion as his legitimate Roman heir, the association enhanced Cleopatra's status. The months following the Alexandrian War allowed Cleopatra to stabilise her position. She travelled with Caesar along the Nile in what ancient sources describe as a grand procession. The journey likely served multiple purposes. It displayed unity between Egyptian monarchy and Roman authority. It reinforced Cleopatra's legitimacy before regional officials. It allowed Caesar to witness the wealth and structure of the kingdom firsthand. Rome and Egypt had met before through diplomacy and debt. Now they were connected through blood and shared military action. The Nile had become entangled with Roman ambition. Caesar eventually departed Egypt to pursue further campaigns. Cleopatra remained behind, ruling with renewed authority. Her alliance with him secured her throne for the moment. It also placed her firmly within Rome's internal politics. For Alexandria, Caesar's arrival marked a turning point. Roman soldiers had marched through its streets. The city had endured siege and fire. Its fate was no longer insulated from Rome's civil wars. Cleopatra's experience during this period deepened her understanding of power. She had navigated exile, secured Roman backing, survived urban warfare, and emerged with strengthened legitimacy. She had also witnessed how swiftly Roman priorities could override local autonomy. The partnership between Cleopatra and Caesar altered the trajectory of the Ptolemaic dynasty. It tied Egypt's future to Rome's evolving structure. Caesar's victory in the Roman Civil War elevated him toward unprecedented authority. Cleopatra's position depended partly on his continued dominance. When Caesar left Egypt, he carried with him impressions of a kingdom wealthy and strategically vital. Cleopatra remained aware that her security required careful management of this relationship. The meeting of Rome and the Nile under Caesar's leadership was not a simple alliance. It was an intersection of ambitions. Cleopatra sought stability and dynastic survival. Caesar sought consolidation of power and reliable grain supply. Their objectives aligned for a time. Yet Rome's internal tensions were far from resolved. Caesar's authority would soon provoke resistance. Cleopatra's future would once again depend on navigating forces beyond her control. The young queen who had once been cast into the desert now stood at the centre of Mediterranean politics. Caesar's arrival had transformed her from embattled co-ruler into a sovereign backed by Rome's strongest general. As Roman ships eventually departed Alexandria's harbour, leaving behind repaired walls and a re-established monarchy, the connection forged during those months would shape the next phase of Cleopatra's life. Rome had come to the Nile, and Egypt would not return to isolation. The palace in Alexandria had once been Cleopatra's home, then a prison in all but name, and finally a place she was forced to abandon. When she returned, she did not enter through the grand gates as a welcomed sovereign. She entered quietly, deliberately, aware that one private meeting could determine whether she would rule or disappear into the margins of history. Julius Caesar had already taken up residence within the royal quarter. Roman standards stood near Egyptian columns. The harbour was tense. Ptolemy XIII's advisors believed they controlled the situation. They assumed that the removal of Cleopatra had secured their position. What they had not accounted for was her willingness to confront risk directly. Cleopatra's approach to the palace required precision. Alexandria was divided in loyalty. News travelled quickly through its streets. She could not march openly through the city with soldiers. She needed to appear before Caesar without interference. The plan that followed became legend. Ancient writers described her being smuggled into the palace, concealed within a bundle of bedding, or a sack carried by a loyal servant. The details may have been embellished, but the essential fact remains that she engineered a private audience under extraordinary circumstances. The image endured because it captured something fundamental about her strategy. She understood that power could shift through a single calculated act. By placing herself physically before Caesar, she removed intermediaries. She controlled the narrative of her own cause. When she was brought into his presence, Cleopatra was not a frightened exile pleading for mercy. She presented herself as the legitimate co-ruler named in her father's will. She framed her removal as unlawful interference by advisors manipulating a minor king. Her education, her command of language, and her composure all shaped this encounter. Caesar had entered Alexandria intending to stabilize Egypt, while pursuing his broader objectives in the Roman Civil War. The murder of Pompey had complicated his plans. Supporting Cleopatra offered an opportunity to assert Roman authority, while appearing to uphold dynastic legality. The meeting that night shifted the balance. Cleopatra secured Caesar's willingness to arbitrate the dispute. More than that, she secured his interest. Their alliance was political from the outset, but it would grow into something more personal as events unfolded. The following days brought tension into open confrontation. Ptolemy XIII and his advisors realized that Cleopatra's presence in the palace threatened their control. Caesar summoned both siblings, declaring his intention to enforce their father's will. The advisors, particularly Pothinus and Achillas, resisted. They rallied forces within Alexandria. The palace became both sanctuary and battlefield. Roman soldiers guarded corridors once reserved for ceremonial processions. Cleopatra remained within these walls, now under Caesar's protection but also at the centre of escalating conflict. Fighting erupted across the city. The Alexandrian War was not a distant skirmish, but an urban siege. Achillas commanded Egyptian troops against Caesar's smaller but disciplined Roman force. Streets filled with smoke and noise. The harbour saw naval clashes. Buildings burned. The instability that had simmered beneath the surface now consumed the capital. Cleopatra's return to power did not unfold gently. It was forged in conflict. Her decision to confront Caesar privately had set in motion events that neither side could easily contain. Within the palace, she observed Roman military organisation at close range. Caesar moved decisively, fortifying positions and securing supply lines. He understood the risks of being outnumbered in a foreign city. Cleopatra saw firsthand how Roman discipline contrasted with the fragmented loyalty of her brother's forces. The war tested Caesar's resolve. Reinforcements were summoned from allied regions. Communication with Roman territories continued under pressure. Cleopatra's position depended entirely on his survival. For Cleopatra, the night of her return had been bold. The weeks that followed required endurance. She remained visible beside Caesar, reinforcing the image of lawful co-ruler supported by Rome. Her presence signalled continuity even as the city fractured. Eventually reinforcements arrived. Caesar's position strengthened. The decisive engagement occurred near the Nile. Ptolemy XIII fled and reportedly drowned while retreating. With his death, the immediate rival to Cleopatra's authority was removed. Caesar declared Cleopatra restored to the throne, formally paired with another younger brother, Ptolemy XIV. The arrangement preserved dynastic tradition, but real authority lay firmly with her. The night in the palace had transformed her position completely. She'd gone from exile to central figure in a Roman-backed restoration. The risk she took by entering Caesar's quarters without ceremony had reshaped Egypt's leadership. Yet this return to power was not simple restoration. It was recalibration. Cleopatra's authority was now intertwined with Rome's. Caesar's influence in Egypt was visible and undeniable. The alliance secured her throne, but it also signalled deeper entanglement. Cleopatra did not retreat into isolation after the war. She appeared publicly as pharaoh, participating in rituals that affirmed divine legitimacy. Temple reliefs depicted her offering to Egyptian gods. She balanced this traditional imagery with the political reality of Roman partnership. During Caesar's extended stay in Egypt, Cleopatra accompanied him on a journey along the Nile. The procession displayed wealth and stability. It was both celebration and strategy. Regional leaders witnessed the alliance. The symbolism reinforced her restored status. In 47 BCE, Cleopatra gave birth to a son, Caesarion. His existence strengthened her claim and complicated Rome's political landscape. The child embodied the union of Egyptian monarchy and Roman authority, though Caesar did not formally acknowledge him as heir under Roman law. The palace that had once excluded her now served as the centre of her renewed power. The corridors that had echoed with opposition now reflected her authority. The night she returned remained significant not because of theatrical detail, but because it demonstrated her willingness to act at decisive moments. Cleopatra understood timing. She recognized when to move quietly and when to appear publicly. Rome and Egypt were now connected more closely than ever. Caesar eventually departed to continue his campaigns, leaving Cleopatra firmly in place. Her throne was secure for the moment, but the broader Mediterranean world remained unsettled. The restoration had required Roman intervention. That reality carried consequences. Cleopatra's independence depended on navigating Rome's internal conflicts carefully. The night in the palace marked not only her return, but the beginning of a new phase in her reign. She had proven her capacity for strategic risk. She'd aligned herself with Rome's most powerful man. As Caesar's ships left Alexandria, the city bore marks of conflict. Yet within the palace, Cleopatra stood stronger than before, aware that the path ahead would demand the same precision and resolve that had brought her back through those guarded doors. The conflict that secured Cleopatra's throne did not end with a single meeting in the palace. Her return to Alexandria placed her beside Julius Caesar, but it did not instantly silence opposition. The struggle for Egypt unfolded along waterways and streets, in fortified quarters and shifting alliances. What had begun as a dispute between siblings widened into a war that would determine not only who ruled Egypt, but how deeply Rome would shape its future. When Caesar agreed to arbitrate between Cleopatra and her brother, he underestimated the determination of those who had controlled Ptolemy XIII's court. Pothinus and Achillas understood that Cleopatra's reinstatement would strip them of influence. They mobilized forces quickly, drawing on troops stationed in Egypt and rallying Alexandrian sentiment against Roman interference. The Roman presence in Alexandria was modest in number. Caesar had brought a seasoned but relatively small contingent, veterans of long campaigns in Gaul and the Roman Civil War. They were disciplined and experienced, but they were not an occupying army large enough to dominate an entire city without resistance. The advisors around Ptolemy XIII believed they could overwhelm him through sheer numbers and local advantage. Hostilities began inside the city itself. Roman troops fortified the palace district, securing strategic points near the harbour and royal compounds. Cleopatra remained within this protected area, under Roman guard. Outside those walls, Egyptian forces loyal to her brother advanced. Fighting in Alexandria was complicated by its geography. The city's wide avenues and monumental structures offered both visibility and vulnerability. The harbour was critical. Control of ships meant control of supply routes. Naval engagements took place near the docks, with Roman and Egyptian vessels clashing for dominance. In one engagement, Caesar ordered Egyptian ships burned to prevent their use against him. The fire spread beyond its intended target, damaging warehouses and possibly nearby structures. Ancient accounts later associated this event with harm to parts of the famed library, though the full extent of destruction remains debated. What is certain is that the city suffered. Cleopatra witnessed firsthand the cost of securing her crown. This was not ceremonial restoration. It was urban warfare. Her authority depended entirely on Caesar's ability to hold the palace and resist siege. The conflict expanded beyond Alexandria's immediate streets. Egyptian forces attempted to cut off Roman access to fresh water. Wells were sabotaged. Caesar responded with engineering solutions, digging new sources and securing supply lines. The confrontation became a contest not only of arms but of endurance. Cleopatra's position during this period required composure. She remained visible beside Caesar when possible, reinforcing the message that she was the legitimate co-ruler supported by Rome. The symbolism mattered. Each appearance signalled continuity and partnership. Meanwhile, Achilles commanded a substantial Egyptian force, bolstered by soldiers who had once served under Cleopatra's father. The loyalty of these troops was divided by politics rather than ethnicity. Some fought for the advisors controlling Ptolemy XIII. Others quietly watched for signs of which side would prevail. The war intensified. Caesar sent messages to allied regions requesting reinforcements. Cleopatra's fate hung on their arrival. Without support, the Roman force risked being overwhelmed. During this period, Ptolemy XIII remained a figurehead. Real decisions were made by those around him. The advisors misjudged Caesar's persistence. They assumed he would withdraw rather than commit fully to an extended siege in a foreign capital. Caesar's experience in protracted campaigns served him well. He fortified his position, divided enemy forces, and maintained morale among his troops. The Roman camp operated with discipline. Cleopatra observed this structure closely. She saw how authority could be maintained even when surrounded. Reinforcements eventually arrived under the command of Mithridates of Pergamon, allied with Caesar. Their approach through the Nile delta shifted momentum. The conflict moved toward the eastern approaches near the Nile itself. The decisive engagement occurred near the river. Egyptian forces loyal to Ptolemy XIII attempted to regroup and resist. The terrain along the Nile presented both opportunity and hazard. The river's currents and marshy banks complicated movement. In the chaos of retreat, Ptolemy XIII reportedly attempted to escape by boat. Accounts described the vessel overturning under the weight of those aboard. The young king drowned in the Nile, his body later recovered in royal armour. With his death, organised resistance collapsed. The advisors who had engineered Cleopatra's exile were eliminated or captured. Caesar declared the conflict resolved. Cleopatra's crown was secured not through inheritance alone, but through military victory. The Alexandrian War had proven that authority required force when challenged. Caesar restructured Egypt's leadership formally. Cleopatra was reinstated as queen. To preserve dynastic tradition, she was paired with another younger brother, Ptolemy XIV. This arrangement maintained the outward appearance of sibling co-rule while leaving practical authority firmly in her hands. The aftermath of war demanded reconstruction. Alexandria bore scars from siege and fire. Trade had been disrupted. Administrative systems required stabilization. Cleopatra moved quickly to restore order. Her collaboration with Caesar continued beyond the battlefield. He remained in Egypt for several months, ensuring that the kingdom was secure and aligned with Roman interests. During this time, Cleopatra consolidated her authority, addressing both Greek elites in Alexandria and Egyptian priests throughout the country. Temple ceremonies resumed. Reliefs depicted her as pharaoh offering gifts to the gods. These rituals signalled continuity despite recent upheaval. The Nile's annual flooding cycle resumed its rhythm, reinforcing a sense of normalcy after conflict. Cleopatra's survival through the war altered perceptions of her. She was no longer merely a co-ruler navigating palace intrigue. She had endured exile, returned through calculated risk, and prevailed in open warfare. The war on the Nile also deepened Egypt's connection to Rome. Caesar's involvement demonstrated that Roman power could determine succession. Cleopatra understood the implications. Securing her throne required maintaining favourable relations with Rome's dominant figures. The months following victory were not idle. Cleopatra accompanied Caesar on a journey along the Nile. The voyage displayed unity and wealth. It allowed Caesar to witness Egypt's agricultural and cultural strength. It allowed Cleopatra to present herself as stable sovereign before regional authorities. In 47 BCE, she gave birth to Caesarion. The child symbolized the alliance forged in conflict. His existence strengthened her claim internally and complicated Roman politics externally. The Alexandrian War had reshaped the Mediterranean balance. Caesar emerged with enhanced prestige. Cleopatra emerged with secured authority. Yet both were aware that Rome's internal struggles were far from over. Securing the Egyptian crown required not only defeating her brother's faction, but also aligning herself with a Roman leader whose own position depended on victory in a larger civil war. As Caesar eventually departed Egypt to continue campaigns elsewhere, Cleopatra remained in Alexandria with a strengthened throne and a clearer understanding of the realities of power. The Nile had witnessed battles before. It would witness more in years to come. For now, its waters reflected a kingdom restored under a queen who had learned that sovereignty demanded resolve, calculation, and alliance in equal measure. When the fighting in Alexandria ended and the smoke cleared from the harbour, Cleopatra did not return to a quiet court removed from Roman influence. Instead, she entered a new phase of rule shaped by partnership with the most powerful man in the Mediterranean. Julius Caesar remained in Egypt for several months after the war, not merely as a victor but as an ally whose presence reinforced Cleopatra's authority. What developed between them during that time blended calculation with personal attachment, and the consequences would extend far beyond the Nile. Caesar was in his early 50s when he arrived in Alexandria. He was a seasoned general, a statesman, and a man accustomed to decisive action. Cleopatra was in her early 20s, newly restored to the throne after exile and civil conflict. Their alliance began as a political necessity. Cleopatra needed Roman backing to secure her crown. Caesar needed stability in Egypt to ensure grain supplies and reinforce his broader campaign for dominance in Rome. Yet their association did not remain strictly formal. Ancient sources describe shared time along the Nile following the Alexandrian War. Cleopatra accompanied Caesar on a journey upriver, travelling in a royal barge designed to project wealth and continuity. The procession served diplomatic and symbolic purposes. Regional officials witnessed unity between Egyptian monarchy and Roman authority. It demonstrated that Cleopatra was firmly reinstated, and that Caesar's support was not temporary. The voyage also allowed Caesar to observe Egypt's agricultural strength directly. The Nile's flooding cycle sustained the kingdom's prosperity. Grain shipments to Rome depended on reliable harvests. Caesar understood the strategic value of this stability. Cleopatra understood that displaying the land's abundance strengthened her negotiating position. During this period, their relationship deepened. Whether driven primarily by affection, ambition, or both, it produced a child. In 47 BCE, Cleopatra gave birth to a son named Ptolemy, the 15th Philopator Philometor Caesar, known to history as Caesarion. His name signalled lineage clearly. To the Egyptian court, he represented dynastic continuity. To Rome, he posed a more complicated question. Caesar did not formally recognise Caesarion as his legal heir under Roman law. He already had a grandnephew, Octavian, who would later be adopted as his successor. Roman custom and politics did not easily accommodate acknowledgement of a foreign-born child with a foreign queen. Yet Caesarion's existence strengthened Cleopatra's internal position. She could present herself not merely as a restored queen, but as mother to the son of Rome's most powerful general. Cleopatra embraced the symbolism carefully. Temple reliefs began to depict her alongside her son, reinforcing traditional imagery of divine motherhood. In Egyptian iconography, the queen and child evoked parallels with Isis and Horus. By aligning Caesarion with these established patterns, Cleopatra strengthened his legitimacy within Egyptian religious tradition. The alliance between Cleopatra and Caesar was never free of calculation. Cleopatra understood that Egypt's independence depended on Rome's internal politics. By binding herself to Caesar, she secured protection against rivals. Caesar in turn benefited from Egypt's resources and from projecting himself as a figure capable of stabilizing distant kingdoms. Caesar remained in Egypt longer than many in Rome expected. His absence from Italy drew criticism from opponents who already feared his growing authority. Rumours circulated in Rome about his connection to Cleopatra. Some saw her as a foreign influence with ambitions to reshape Roman governance. Others exaggerated her role to undermine Caesar's reputation. Cleopatra's presence in Caesar's life became part of Rome's political discourse. Roman elites were wary of monarchy. The memory of kings had long shaped republican ideology. Caesar's opponents framed his association with an Eastern queen as evidence of monarchical ambition. In 46 BCE, Cleopatra travelled to Rome with Caesarion. She stayed in a villa across the Tiber, not within the city's political core, but close enough to remain visible. Her arrival attracted attention. A foreign queen living near Rome's centre was unprecedented. Statues of Cleopatra were reportedly erected in honour of her alliance with Caesar. For Cleopatra, the journey to Rome was strategic. It allowed her to reinforce ties directly. It demonstrated her status as a sovereign equal rather than a subordinate client. It also exposed her to Rome's internal tensions. The Roman Republic at this stage was unstable. Caesar had assumed extraordinary powers, including the title of dictator. His reforms aimed to stabilise governance, but they also concentrated authority. Opposition simmered among senators who feared the erosion of traditional structures. Cleopatra observed this climate closely. She had already witnessed how fragile power could be within her own family. Now she saw similar tensions within Rome. Her position depended on Caesar's continued dominance. If his authority collapsed, Egypt's security would be uncertain again. Caesarion's birth strengthened her claim at home but complicated perceptions abroad. Some Romans speculated about succession. Though Caesar never declared Caesarion heir, the child's existence fueled anxiety among those who opposed him. In 44 BCE, events unfolded quickly. A group of senators, fearing Caesar's concentration of power, assassinated him on the Ides of March. The act shocked Rome and reverberated across the Mediterranean. Cleopatra was still in Italy at the time. Caesar's death altered her position instantly. Without his protection, her presence in Rome became precarious. She returned to Egypt soon afterward, accompanied by her son. Back in Alexandria, she faced a new political landscape. Rome was entering another phase of civil conflict. Caesar's assassins sought to restore republican balance. His supporters rallied around his legacy. Cleopatra needed to reposition herself carefully. The death of Caesar did not diminish Caesarion's symbolic value within Egypt. Cleopatra presented her son as co-ruler, reinforcing dynastic continuity. Temple reliefs and official inscriptions reflected this arrangement. The child embodied both Egyptian and Roman connection. At the same time, Cleopatra acted decisively within her own household. Her co-ruler, Ptolemy XIV, died shortly after her return to Egypt. Ancient sources suggest possible poisoning, though certainty is impossible. His death left Cleopatra and Caesarion as joint sovereigns. The pattern of sibling rivalry that had shaped earlier generations ended with her son's elevation. Cleopatra's approach combined personal attachment and strategic awareness. Her relationship with Caesar may have involved genuine affection, but it also secured Egypt during a vulnerable period. Caesarion's birth strengthened her internal legitimacy, even as it complicated Roman politics. Love and strategy were not opposing forces in her life. They operated together. Cleopatra understood that emotional bonds could reinforce political alliances. She also recognized that alliances built solely on sentiment were fragile. After Caesar's death, Rome fractured once more. Power shifted toward a new triumvirate composed of Mark Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus. Cleopatra would soon find herself negotiating with Antony, whose control over the eastern provinces made him a pivotal figure. The period following Caesarion's birth marked a transition. Cleopatra was no longer a young queen fighting to regain her throne. She was a mother, a sovereign aligned with Rome's most powerful faction, and a figure whose decisions carried consequences across the Mediterranean. The child she named Caesarion represented continuity, ambition, and risk. His existence tied Egypt's destiny to Rome's internal struggles more tightly than ever. As Rome reorganized itself after Caesar's assassination, Cleopatra prepared to engage with its next leaders. The alliance forged with Caesar had secured her crown for a time. Now she would navigate a new chapter in which Rome's divisions would once again shape the future of Egypt and the fate of her son. When Cleopatra arrived in Rome in 46 BCE, she did not enter as a captive or a client seeking recognition. She came as an ally of Julius Caesar, ruler of a kingdom whose grain fed Roman citizens and whose wealth commanded respect. Yet her presence in the city unsettled many. Rome prided itself on republican tradition. Its political memory was shaped by the expulsion of kings centuries earlier. A reigning queen from the east living near the centre of power challenged that identity. Cleopatra did not reside within the Roman Forum or the Senate's shadow. Caesar arranged accommodations for her across the Tiber in one of his private estates. The location offered both proximity and distance. She was near enough to remain visible, yet separate from the heart of Roman political ritual. Even so, her presence was unmistakable. Rome at this stage was in transition. Caesar had emerged victorious from civil war. He had assumed extraordinary powers, including the title of Dictator Perpetuo. Public works projects reshaped the city. Veterans were settled. Reforms were introduced to reorganize the calendar and administrative systems. To supporters, Caesar was stabilizing a fractured republic. To critics, he was eroding its foundations. Cleopatra entered this environment fully aware that her association with Caesar could be used against him. Roman society viewed Eastern monarchies with suspicion. Luxury, courtly ceremony, and divine kingship were features Romans often contrasted with their own ideals of civic restraint. Cleopatra embodied many of these Eastern associations in the Roman imagination, whether fairly or not. Her arrival drew attention not only because she was a queen, but because she was visible. Roman writers later described her elegance, her intelligence, and the cultural contrast she represented. She brought with her a small entourage and the young Caesarion. The child's presence was politically delicate. Although Caesar did not publicly declare him heir under Roman law, rumours circulated regarding the nature of their relationship. A statue of Cleopatra was reportedly placed in the Temple of Venus Genetrix, a shrine associated with Caesar's claimed divine ancestry. The gesture reinforced their alliance, but also fueled criticism. Opponents argued that Caesar was elevating a foreign queen within sacred Roman space. Cleopatra herself had to navigate carefully. She was not there to dominate Roman politics openly. Her objective was to maintain Egypt's security and strengthen ties with Caesar. She likely attended select gatherings, received diplomats, and engaged with Roman elites who sought access to Caesar's circle. Roman society was layered and competitive. Senators watched one another closely. Any sign of monarchical ambition could be exploited. Cleopatra's presence became part of the political conversation. Some accused Caesar of contemplating a move toward kingship, citing his relationship with an Eastern monarch as evidence. Caesar did little to dispel these suspicions. He accepted honours that blurred traditional republican boundaries. He centralised authority. His reforms were sweeping. While many citizens welcomed stability after years of civil conflict, others feared the concentration of power. Cleopatra observed these tensions firsthand. Her own upbringing had exposed her to sibling rivalry and palace intrigue. In Rome, she witnessed similar undercurrents, though expressed through senatorial debate rather than dynastic marriage. For Cleopatra, the city presented contrasts. Unlike Alexandria's planned avenues and Mediterranean harbour, Rome was ancient, crowded and layered with tradition. Its temples and public spaces reflected centuries of civic identity. The Senate remained a powerful institution in symbolism, even as Caesar's authority overshadowed it. Her status in Rome was ambiguous. She was not a Roman citizen, She did not hold office, yet her proximity to Caesar gave her influence. Foreign dignitaries and petitioners likely sought her insight, aware that Egypt's resources mattered. The Roman elite responded in varied ways. Some were curious about her culture and education. Others viewed her as a symbol of foreign encroachment. Roman moralists criticized what they perceived as Eastern extravagance. Cleopatra's intelligence and presence may have impressed some observers, but admiration and resentment often coexisted. The young Caesarian's role was equally sensitive. To Egyptians, he embodied continuity. To Romans, he posed a question that few were willing to articulate openly. If Caesar acknowledged him formally, what would that mean for succession? Caesar had no legitimate Roman son. His grandnephew Octavian stood as potential heir, but the situation remained fluid. Cleopatra's time in Rome was therefore both opportunity and exposure. She strengthened ties directly with Caesar while observing the instability surrounding him. She understood that her position depended on his survival. In March of 44 BCE, the tension reached a breaking point. A group of senators, including men once allied with Caesar, conspired to assassinate him. They believed his growing power threatened the Republic. On the Ides of March, Caesar was stabbed in the Senate House. The assassination stunned Rome. Chaos followed. Cleopatra's position changed immediately. Without Caesar's protection, her safety could not be guaranteed. The political climate turned volatile. Supporters and opponents of Caesar maneuvered rapidly. Cleopatra did not remain in Rome long after his death. She returned to Egypt with Caesarion. The journey back to Alexandria marked the end of a chapter in which she had stood near the centre of Roman transformation. Her time in Rome had provided insight into the Republic's fragility. She had witnessed how swiftly alliances shifted, and how personal loyalty could be overturned by collective fear. The assassination confirmed that no leader, however powerful, was immune to conspiracy. Back in Egypt, Cleopatra acted decisively. Her co-ruler, Ptolemy XIV, died soon afterward. With his death, Caesarion was elevated as her partner on the throne. Cleopatra ensured that Egypt's leadership remained consolidated around her and her son. Rome's internal conflict resumed after Caesar's assassination. His supporters, including Mark Antony and Octavian, formed a triumvirate to pursue the conspirators. Cleopatra monitored these developments closely. Egypt's security depended on understanding which Roman faction would prevail. Her experience in Rome had reinforced key lessons. Power in Rome was collective and contested, not hereditary in the manner of Eastern monarchies. Public opinion, senatorial approval, and military loyalty intersected unpredictably. Cleopatra's status as a foreign queen in Rome had amplified scrutiny. It had also allowed her to study Roman politics from within. She had seen firsthand the ambition of figures like Antony and the emerging presence of Octavian. As Rome reorganized under the triumvirate, Cleopatra prepared for renewed negotiation. The alliance with Caesar had secured her throne temporarily. Now she faced a new generation of Roman leaders whose interests might align or conflict with hers. Her time in Rome left no illusion that stability was permanent. The Republic was evolving, and Egypt's fate would continue to intersect with its power struggles. The foreign queen who had walked through Roman gardens and witnessed Senate debates returned to Alexandria with sharpened awareness. She would soon engage with Mark Antony, whose authority in the eastern provinces positioned him as Rome's most relevant figure for Egypt. The chapter of her life in Rome had ended abruptly with Caesar's death, but its lessons endured. Cleopatra had stood at the heart of an empire in transition. She'd observed how ambition, fear, and reform collided. Now, as Rome divided once again, she would step back into diplomacy, carrying with her the knowledge that proximity to Roman power could elevate or endanger a throne in equal measure. The news reached Alexandria not as rumour, but as confirmation. Julius Caesar, the man whose intervention had restored Cleopatra to power and whose alliance had secured Egypt during a fragile moment, was dead. On the Ides of March in 44 BCE, He had been stabbed within the Senate House by men who claimed to defend the Roman Republic. The act shattered whatever sense of predictability had existed in the Mediterranean. For Cleopatra, it meant the sudden removal of her most powerful ally. When Caesar fell, the structure that had supported her position shifted instantly. She had tied Egypt's stability to his authority. Now Rome entered another phase of internal conflict. The conspirators believed they had ended a threat to republican tradition. Instead, they unleashed uncertainty. Cleopatra was still in Italy when Caesar was assassinated. She had been residing near Rome, maintaining her presence as ally and partner. With Caesar gone, her situation became precarious. She had no formal standing in Roman law. Her safety depended on how rapidly Rome's factions reorganized. The immediate aftermath in Rome was chaotic. Senators fled or fortified their positions. Crowds reacted with confusion and anger. Mark Antony, Caesar's close associate and serving consul, moved quickly to secure documents and rally supporters. Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, was still in the provinces but would soon enter the political arena. Cleopatra assessed her position carefully. Remaining in Rome without Caesar's protection carried risk. She had a young son to consider, a child whose paternity linked him symbolically to the murdered dictator. The association that had once strengthened her claim could now provoke hostility. She departed Italy and returned to Egypt. The journey across the Mediterranean was more than a retreat. It was a strategic withdrawal. In Alexandria, she could consolidate authority and prepare for Rome's next chapter from a position of relative security. Upon her return, Cleopatra acted decisively within her own household. Ptolemy XIV, her younger brother and co-ruler, died soon afterward. Ancient sources later suggested poisoning, though certainty is impossible. What is clear is that his death removed a potential rival and allowed Cleopatra to elevate her son Caesarion as co-ruler. The decision strengthened her internal position. By pairing herself with Caesarion, she reinforced dynastic continuity and aligned Egypt symbolically with Caesar's legacy. Temple inscriptions and reliefs reflected this arrangement. Cleopatra and Caesarion were depicted in traditional pharaonic roles, affirming stability despite Rome's turmoil. Rome, meanwhile, did not settle into calm. The assassins, including Brutus and Cassius, attempted to justify their actions as defense of liberty. Caesar's supporters mobilized in response. Mark Antony delivered a funeral oration that inflamed public sentiment against the conspirators. Violence erupted in the streets. Octavian, only 18 years old, arrived in Italy to claim his inheritance as Caesar's adopted son. Though young, he possessed determination and political acumen. His presence complicated the balance between Antony and other Roman leaders. In 43 BCE, the Second Triumvirate was formed, legally granting Antony, Octavian and Lepidus extraordinary powers to restore order. They pursued Caesar's assassins relentlessly. Proscriptions targeted political enemies, including prominent figures such as Cicero. Cleopatra observed these developments from Alexandria with keen interest. Egypt's independence depended on understanding which Roman leader would ultimately prevail. The eastern provinces fell largely under Mark Antony's authority. This made him the most immediate Roman figure relevant to Egypt's future. The uncertainty following Caesar's assassination forced Cleopatra to reconsider alliances. Her connection to Caesar had secured her throne. Now she needed to engage with those who controlled Rome's military strength. Egypt remained valuable to Rome regardless of leadership. Its grain supply was indispensable. Its treasury was attractive to any faction financing campaigns. Cleopatra understood that Egypt's wealth could serve as leverage, but only if deployed carefully. The assassination also altered public perception of Caesarion. In Egypt, he was promoted as son of a great Roman leader. In Rome, his status was ambiguous. Octavian's legal adoption as Caesar's heir placed him ahead in Roman succession. Caesarion's claim was symbolic rather than formal. Cleopatra's strategy focused on maintaining Egypt's autonomy. while avoiding premature commitment to any Roman faction. She refrained from openly supporting Caesar's assassins or immediately aligning herself with the triumvirs. Caution was essential. The Eastern Mediterranean became a theatre of shifting loyalties. Cities declared support for one Roman leader or another. Military campaigns resumed. Cleopatra positioned Egypt as stable and neutral while monitoring the balance of power. The period after Caesar's fall was not defined by dramatic gestures from Cleopatra, but by calculated patience. She consolidated internal governance. She strengthened temple ties. She ensured that grain shipments continued, reinforcing Egypt's reliability as supplier. Mark Antony's authority in the eastern provinces would soon draw him into direct engagement with Cleopatra. In 41 BCE, he summoned her to Tarsus to answer questions regarding her loyalty during Rome's recent conflicts. The invitation signalled the beginning of a new alliance. Caesar's assassination had removed one anchor and created space for another. Cleopatra recognised that survival required adaptation. Her education and earlier experiences with rivalry had prepared her for instability. She had seen how quickly fortunes could change. Rome's transition from republic to empire was accelerating, though few yet named it as such. The triumvirate exercised power in ways that bypassed traditional checks. Military authority increasingly determined political outcomes. Cleopatra's response to uncertainty was steady consolidation. She reinforced Caesarion's visibility in state imagery. She maintained Egypt's economic strength. She avoided entanglement in Roman conflicts until necessity demanded engagement. The years immediately following Caesar's death were marked by tension rather than resolution. The assassins were eventually defeated at Philippi in 42 BCE. Antony and Octavian emerged as dominant figures, though rivalry between them simmered beneath cooperation. Cleopatra's future would soon intersect with Antony's ambitions in the east. Caesar's fall had ended one alliance and opened another path. The uncertainty of 44 BCE had forced Cleopatra to act swiftly and quietly. She had secured her throne at home and prepared to negotiate anew abroad. The lessons of Rome's instability remained vivid. As Antony consolidated control over the eastern provinces, Cleopatra would be summoned to account for her actions and to define Egypt's role in Rome's evolving power structure. The era shaped by Caesar had ended. A new alignment was approaching, and Cleopatra stood ready to navigate it. By 41 BCE, the Mediterranean had been divided, at least in theory. After the defeat of Caesar's assassins at Philippi, authority in Rome rested with three men: Mark Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus. The arrangement was uneasy from the beginning. Antony assumed control over the eastern provinces, including territories that bordered Egypt. This placed him in a position to influence Cleopatra's future directly. Antony was not Caesar. He lacked Caesar's calculated restraint, but possessed charisma and a reputation for boldness. He had served as Caesar's trusted lieutenant, commanding troops with energy and earning loyalty among soldiers. After Caesar's death, he had positioned himself as defender of his legacy. Now, with the East under his command, he turned his attention toward consolidating resources and punishing perceived disloyalty. Cleopatra received a summons to meet Antony in Tarsus, a city in Cilicia. The request was formal, but carried implicit pressure. Antony wanted to question her regarding Egypt's conduct during Rome's recent civil war. He also needed financial and logistical support for campaigns against Parthia, a rival power to the east. Cleopatra understood the significance of the invitation. Antony controlled the Eastern Roman legions. Refusing to appear would signal defiance. Appearing without preparation would risk subordination. She chose to meet him on her own terms. When Cleopatra travelled to Tarsus, she did so with deliberate theatricality. Ancient sources describe her arriving by river in a grand vessel, adorned with rich fabrics and gold accents. She was said to have presented herself as an embodiment of the goddess Isis, blending religious symbolism with royal imagery. Whether every detail of the account is accurate, the intent was clear. Cleopatra would not appear as a summoned subordinate. She would arrive as sovereign equal. Antony was reportedly struck by the display. He was a man who appreciated spectacle and understood symbolism. Cleopatra's entrance reframed the meeting from interrogation to negotiation. She hosted Antony aboard her vessel, reversing expectations. Instead of standing before him as accused ruler, she positioned him as guest. The alliance that followed combined political calculation with personal connection. Antony needed Egypt's wealth and stability to fund his eastern ambitions. Cleopatra needed Roman protection and recognition to secure her dynasty. Their interests aligned. Cleopatra returned to Alexandria with Antony that winter. He remained there for several months, establishing both partnership and intimacy. The relationship was not hidden. Public celebrations and joint appearances reinforced the bond. In 40 BCE, Cleopatra gave birth to twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene. The children symbolized the strengthening of ties between Egypt and Rome's eastern authority. Later, a third child, Ptolemy Philadelphus, would be born. Antony's association with Cleopatra did not occur in isolation from Roman politics. Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, remained in the West, consolidating his own power. The triumvirate functioned outwardly, but tension simmered beneath it. Antony's presence in Alexandria attracted criticism in Rome. Roman elites were sensitive to perceptions of Eastern influence. Cleopatra's wealth and ceremonial style contrasted sharply with Roman republican austerity. Octavian would later exploit this contrast skillfully. For Cleopatra, the alliance offered tangible advantages. Antony confirmed her control over Cyprus and other territories that strengthened Egypt's position. He recognized Caesarion publicly as son of Julius Caesar, a move that complicated Octavian's narrative as sole heir. The partnership extended beyond personal attachment into overt political theatre. In 34 BCE, after a campaign in Armenia, Antony staged a ceremony in Alexandria known as the Donations of Alexandria. During the event, territories were distributed symbolically among Cleopatra and her children. Caesarion was declared King of Kings. Cleopatra was styled as Queen of Kings. The ceremony blended Roman military triumph with Egyptian royal imagery. It was bold and controversial. Antony appeared not as Roman magistrate but as Eastern monarch alongside Cleopatra. The spectacle reinforced their power in the East but provided Octavian with ammunition. Octavian framed Antony's actions as betrayal of Roman values. He portrayed Cleopatra as a manipulative foreign queen influencing Antony away from his duties. Roman propaganda emphasized her identity as outsider, casting her as threat rather than ally. Cleopatra understood that public image mattered. She embraced Egyptian religious symbolism, appearing in temple reliefs as Isis incarnate. She reinforced her legitimacy at home while aligning with Antony's campaigns abroad. Antony, for his part, relied heavily on Egypt's financial support. His campaigns against Parthia required funding and supplies. Cleopatra's treasury became essential. The alliance was reciprocal. Antony offered military backing and territorial recognition. Cleopatra provided resources and stability. Their partnership was not free of strain. Antony maintained connections in Rome, including his marriage to Octavia, Octavian's sister. Political marriages remained tools of alliance. Cleopatra recognized the complexity. The arrangement reflected Roman pragmatism rather than exclusivity. Over time, Antony's alignment with Cleopatra deepened, and his ties to Rome loosened. He spent extended periods in the East. His decisions increasingly reflected Eastern priorities. Octavian capitalized on this shift. Roman sentiment turned gradually. Octavian positioned himself as defender of tradition against Eastern excess. He publicized Antony's will, allegedly revealing plans to leave territories to Cleopatra's children. Whether the document was interpreted fairly mattered less than its impact. Cleopatra's strategy combined confidence and caution. She did not hide her partnership with Antony. She framed it as an alliance between sovereign powers. She reinforced Egypt's prosperity through trade and careful administration. The bond between Cleopatra and Antony was genuine in its intensity, yet inseparable from political necessity. Their children represented both affection and strategic continuity. As tensions between Antony and Octavian escalated, Cleopatra prepared for the possibility of open confrontation. Egypt's navy was strengthened, alliances were reviewed. The Mediterranean was dividing into spheres that could not coexist indefinitely. The alliance that had begun with theatrical arrival in Tarsus now faced its most serious test. Antony's loyalty to Cleopatra and Cleopatra's reliance on Antony placed Egypt directly in the path of Rome's internal conflict. The stage was set for a decisive confrontation that would determine not only the fate of Antony and Octavian, but the survival of the Ptolemaic dynasty itself. By 34 BCE, the alliance between Cleopatra and Mark Antony had matured into something more visible and more provocative than private partnership or quiet diplomacy. Their connection had already produced children, territorial agreements, and shared military campaigns. Now it moved into the realm of public declaration. What unfolded in Alexandria that year was not merely a ceremony, it was a statement of intent, one that would echo across the Mediterranean and sharpen the conflict with Octavian. Antony had recently concluded a campaign in Armenia. Though the campaign's success was debated in Rome, he presented it as a triumph. Instead of returning immediately to Italy to celebrate in traditional Roman fashion, he chose to stage a grand event in Alexandria. The location was deliberate. Alexandria was Cleopatra's capital, centre of Hellenistic culture, and symbol of Egypt's sovereignty. By holding the ceremony there, Antony signalled that the eastern provinces were not peripheral. They were central to his vision. The event became known as the Donations of Alexandria. In a formal gathering attended by officials, soldiers, and foreign dignitaries, Antony and Cleopatra appeared seated upon golden thrones. Cleopatra was dressed in traditional regalia, emphasizing her identity as pharaoh. Beside her stood their children, each positioned carefully for the roles that were about to be assigned. The ceremony unfolded as a distribution of territories. Alexander Helios, their young son, was declared ruler of Armenia and lands extending toward Parthia, though much of that territory remained contested. Cleopatra Selene was designated Queen of Cyrenaica and Crete. Ptolemy Philadelphus was granted symbolic authority over Syria and Cilicia. Most significantly, Caesarion was proclaimed King of Kings and recognized publicly as son of Julius Caesar. Cleopatra herself was styled Queen of Kings, a title that elevated her above client monarchs and reinforced her authority across the eastern Mediterranean. The language used during the ceremony emphasized sovereignty, continuity, and legitimacy. To Egyptian observers, the spectacle affirmed stability and ambition. It presented Cleopatra's children as heirs not merely to Egypt, but to a broader Eastern order. The ceremony blended Egyptian royal symbolism with Hellenistic pageantry. It was calculated to impress and to define. For Antony, the donations served multiple purposes. They rewarded Cleopatra's support during his campaigns. They reinforced alliances with regional elites by creating a dynastic structure aligned with his Eastern authority. They also projected an image of strength at a time when his military reputation required reinforcement. Yet the ceremony's symbolism carried consequences beyond Alexandria. In Rome, news of the donations was received with alarm and indignation. Octavian seized upon the event as proof that Antony intended to reshape Roman power around an Eastern monarchy. The idea that territories traditionally under Roman influence were being distributed by Antony in a foreign capital undermined his standing among Roman conservatives. The public recognition of Caesarion as son of Julius Caesar was particularly inflammatory. Octavian's own claim to leadership rested on his adoption by Caesar. Acknowledging Caesarion's lineage threatened that narrative. Octavian framed the donations as evidence that Antony had abandoned Roman values in favour of Eastern decadence. Propaganda intensified. Octavian supporters circulated stories portraying Cleopatra as manipulative and ambitious beyond measure. They emphasised her foreignness, her wealth, and her influence over Antony. The donations became central to this narrative. Cleopatra was aware of the reaction. The ceremony had not been impulsive. It was an assertion that the Eastern Mediterranean could function as a political sphere independent of Rome's direct control. She envisioned a network of territories governed by her children, aligned with Antony's authority and anchored in Egypt. The strategy reflected long-standing Hellenistic practice. Successor kingdoms had often distributed territories among heirs to solidify alliances. Cleopatra's adaptation of this model aimed to secure continuity for her dynasty beyond Egypt's borders. In Alexandria, the ceremony reinforced her legitimacy domestically. Temple rituals incorporated the new titles. Coins and inscriptions reflected the updated hierarchy. The message to Egyptian elites was clear. The dynasty was strong and its future was mapped. Antony's position became more precarious in Rome. Though still formally allied with Octavian within the triumvirate, trust had eroded. Lepidus had already been marginalised. Power was consolidating between Antony and Octavian. The donations marked a turning point. What had been rivalry beneath the surface became open ideological division. Octavian portrayed himself as defender of Roman tradition against Antony's Eastern entanglement. He emphasised the threat of a foreign queen influencing Roman governance. Cleopatra's perspective combined confidence and calculation. She understood that projecting strength could deter aggression. She also recognised that Octavian's hostility would not dissipate. Antony's continued residence in the East reinforced Octavian's narrative. Each month spent away from Rome allowed his rival to consolidate support among senators and veterans. The donations, while bold, increased the likelihood of direct confrontation. Egypt prepared accordingly. Naval forces were strengthened. Resources were allocated carefully. Cleopatra maintained diplomatic contacts where possible, though the path toward reconciliation narrowed. The ceremony in Alexandria had declared a new Eastern order, at least symbolically. It placed Cleopatra and her children at the centre of a network extending beyond Egypt's traditional borders. It also clarified for Rome that Antony's loyalty lay increasingly with the East. Octavian's response evolved from criticism to mobilization. He framed the coming conflict not as civil war, but as defense of Rome against foreign domination. The narrative resonated. The donations of Alexandria thus served as both culmination and catalyst. They represented Cleopatra's most assertive vision of dynastic expansion. They also provided Octavian with the justification he needed to escalate. The Mediterranean moved closer to open war. Antony and Cleopatra stood aligned against a rising Roman leader who would not accept divided authority. The golden thrones in Alexandria had displayed ambition without restraint. Now the consequences would unfold across sea and shore, as Rome prepared to confront the Eastern alliance that had declared itself so openly before the world. By the mid-30s BCE, the rivalry between Mark Antony and Octavian had moved beyond quiet competition and into deliberate confrontation. The triumvirate that once bound them together had effectively dissolved in trust, even if its legal structure lingered. Antony remained in the east with Cleopatra. Octavian consolidated power in the west, presenting himself as guardian of Roman tradition. The donations of Alexandria had given him precisely the material he needed to shape public perception. Octavian understood that military strength alone would not secure victory. Rome's citizens and senators needed to believe that the coming conflict was justified. He reframed the struggle not as a civil war between Roman leaders, but as a defense of Rome against foreign influence. Cleopatra became central to this narrative. The portrayal was calculated and relentless. Octavian's supporters described Cleopatra as an Eastern monarch bent on dominating Roman policy. Her wealth, courtly ceremony, an alliance with Antony were presented as evidence that Antony had abandoned Roman discipline in favour of foreign luxury. The language emphasised excess and manipulation. Octavian positioned himself as protector of Roman virtue. He emphasised Antony's prolonged residence in Alexandria and his participation in the donations. The distribution of territories to Cleopatra's children was framed as betrayal of Roman sovereignty. To Roman audiences wary of monarchy, the spectacle of Antony seated beside Cleopatra in Alexandria appeared troubling. The propaganda campaign intensified when Octavian allegedly obtained Antony's will. According to Roman sources, the document expressed Antony's desire to be buried in Alexandria and to leave significant assets to Cleopatra's children. Whether every detail was accurate mattered less than the impact of its public reading. The Senate reacted with alarm. Octavian used the will to argue that Antony's loyalty lay with Egypt rather than Rome. The implication was clear. This was no longer a political disagreement. It was a defence of Rome's identity. Cleopatra's foreign status made her an effective target. Roman political culture had long contrasted itself with Eastern monarchies. Cleopatra was depicted as cunning, seductive, and dangerous. The narrative emphasised her influence over Antony's decisions. Antony himself was portrayed as weakened, distracted, and compromised. Cleopatra did not respond with equivalent propaganda in Rome. Her influence operated primarily through alliance with Antony and the strength of Egypt's resources. The contest for Roman public opinion belonged largely to Octavian. Meanwhile, Antony faced the challenge of maintaining support among Roman legions stationed in the east. His soldiers remained loyal to him personally, but the broader Roman electorate was shifting toward Octavian's interpretation of events. The Senate eventually declared war, not directly on Antony, but on Cleopatra. The distinction was strategic. Framing the conflict as war against a foreign queen allowed Octavian to present himself as defender of Rome rather than aggressor in a civil dispute. Cleopatra recognized the seriousness of this shift. Being declared Rome's enemy formalized the confrontation. Egypt's resources would now be tested against Rome's consolidated power. Preparations accelerated. Antony and Cleopatra gathered fleets and troops. Naval strength became central. The Mediterranean would serve as the stage for decisive engagement. Octavian appointed Marcus Agrippa, a capable admiral, to command his fleet. Agrippa's strategic mind would prove critical in the coming conflict. Ports were secured, supply lines were organised. Octavian ensured that his forces were well positioned. Cleopatra's navy, bolstered by Egyptian and allied vessels, assembled alongside Antony's fleet. The two leaders positioned themselves along the western coast of Greece near Actium. The location was strategic, controlling passage between the Adriatic and Ionian seas. Propaganda continued even as armies mobilized. Octavian's messaging emphasized Roman identity. Antony's association with Cleopatra was framed as abandonment of ancestral values. Public ceremonies in Rome reinforced loyalty to Octavian. Cleopatra's own presentation remained consistent with her established image. She appeared in Egyptian regalia, reinforcing domestic authority. She maintained her alliance with Antony openly, signalling that retreat was not an option. The conflict that approached was not merely military, it was ideological. Octavian had successfully cast himself as defender of Rome against Eastern excess. Cleopatra and Antony represented an alternative vision of power centered in the Mediterranean East. Within Egypt, Cleopatra reinforced stability. Grain shipments were carefully managed. Treasury resources were allocated to support the fleet. The population was prepared for the possibility of extended conflict. The propaganda war had altered the landscape irreversibly. Octavian had shifted Roman opinion from divided sympathy to focused opposition. By declaring war on Cleopatra, he simplified the narrative. Antony, once Caesar's trusted lieutenant, now stood framed as collaborator with foreign ambition. Cleopatra, once Rome's ally through Caesar, now bore the title of adversary. As fleets gathered near Actium in 31 BCE, the outcome would determine not only control of Rome, but the survival of the Ptolemaic dynasty. The campaign of words had prepared the ground for a campaign of ships and soldiers. The Mediterranean held its breath as the two forces faced one another across open water. Cleopatra understood that defeat would mean more than loss of territory. It would mean the end of Egypt's independence and the extinction of her dynasty. Octavian's propaganda had turned Rome against her. Now the struggle would move from speeches and declarations to the clash of fleets under the Greek sun, where the future of both Rome and Egypt would be decided. By 31 BCE, the Mediterranean had divided into two clear camps. On one side stood Octavian, supported by Marcus Agrippa and a disciplined Roman fleet. On the other stood Mark Antony and Cleopatra, aligned in purpose and resources, their ships anchored near the western coast of Greece. The confrontation that approached would not be a brief skirmish. It would decide whether Rome remained centred in Italy or shifted toward an eastern partnership anchored in Alexandria. The chosen ground was the Gulf of Ambracia near Actium. Antony and Cleopatra established their position along the coast, constructing fortifications and gathering supplies. Their fleet was formidable in size, composed of large, heavily built ships capable of carrying substantial crews and artillery. Cleopatra contributed a significant portion of the naval strength, drawing from Egypt's maritime resources. Octavian's strategy relied heavily on Agrippa's experience. Agrippa had already secured key ports and cut off supply routes, gradually weakening Antony's position. Rather than rush into direct engagement, Octavian's forces tightened control of surrounding waters, limiting Antony's access to reinforcements and provisions. Months passed in tension. Disease and shortages affected Antony's encampment. Morale fluctuated. Cleopatra remained present with her fleet, an unusual role for a reigning queen in direct proximity to large-scale naval warfare. Her presence signalled commitment and resolve. Antony faced strategic decisions. His ships were larger and heavily armed, but less manoeuvrable. Octavian's fleet was smaller and more agile. Prolonged delay favoured Octavian, whose supply lines were secure. Antony needed to break the encirclement or withdraw. On September 2nd, 31 BCE, the fleets engaged. The morning opened with cautious manoeuvring. The sea was calm, the air heavy with anticipation. Antony's line advanced cautiously, seeking to create an opening. Octavian's fleet maintained disciplined formation under Agrippa's direction. The battle unfolded gradually rather than in a single dramatic collision. Ships rammed, grappled, and exchanged projectiles. The size of Antony's vessels provided strength in direct confrontation but limited flexibility. Octavian's ships exploited mobility, targeting flanks and isolating segments. Cleopatra's fleet remained positioned slightly behind Antony's main line. Accounts differ on whether this placement reflected strategic reserve or preparation for retreat. What is clear is that as the battle progressed and momentum shifted, Cleopatra made a decisive move. At a critical moment, her squadron turned and sailed through an opening in Octavian's line, heading south toward open water. Antony observed the maneuver and made a rapid decision. Rather than remain and continue the fight, he broke away with a portion of his ships and followed Cleopatra. The reasons for this withdrawal have been debated for centuries. Some suggest it was a prearranged plan to preserve remaining forces. Others view it as a response to deteriorating conditions. Regardless of intent, the effect was immediate. With Antony's departure, the remaining fleet lost coordination. Octavian's forces capitalized, securing decisive victory. The Battle of Actium ended not with the total destruction of Antony's navy, but with the collapse of his strategic position. Octavian emerged with clear advantage. The sea had shifted the balance of power. Antony and Cleopatra retreated to Egypt. Their combined forces were diminished but not entirely destroyed. Yet the psychological impact was significant. Allies reconsidered loyalty. Territories previously aligned with Antony shifted toward Octavian. Octavian did not rush immediately to Egypt. He consolidated control over the eastern Mediterranean first, securing ports and strengthening alliances. The momentum was now firmly in his favour. Back in Alexandria, Cleopatra prepared for the inevitable. She reinforced defences and secured the treasury. She explored diplomatic avenues, though options narrowed. The defeat at Actium had altered perceptions irrevocably. Antony struggled with the consequences. His military reputation had been central to his authority. The withdrawal at Actium undermined that image. Cleopatra's position, tied so closely to his fortunes, was equally vulnerable. Octavian advanced methodically. By 30 BCE, his forces approached Egypt directly. Alexandria braced for confrontation once more. The naval defeat at Actium had ensured that any defence would be limited. The battle's significance extended beyond immediate loss. Actium marked the turning point in Rome's transformation. Octavian's victory paved the way for his consolidation of power. In 27 BCE, he would assume the title Augustus, inaugurating the Roman Empire. For Cleopatra, Actium represented the beginning of the end. The alliance that had promised a new Eastern order now faced extinction. The sea that day had determined not only the outcome of a campaign, but the structure of Mediterranean governance for centuries to come. The retreat from Actium did not erase Cleopatra's resolve. She remained in Alexandria, aware that her final decisions would shape her legacy. Antony's loyalty to her persisted despite defeat. The bond between them endured even as their options diminished. Octavian's advance toward Egypt would soon force confrontation on land. Actium had changed the strategic map. The next phase would determine whether Cleopatra could negotiate survival or face irreversible loss. The waters off Actium had carried fleets into history. In their wake remained a Mediterranean world poised to shift from republic to empire, and a queen preparing to confront the consequences of a battle that had redrawn the course of power. After the retreat from Actium, Alexandria did not immediately collapse into despair. The city had endured siege before. It had survived internal conflict and Roman intervention. Cleopatra returned with Antony not as fugitives without authority, but as rulers preparing for one final defence. Yet the balance had shifted irrevocably. Octavian advanced with steady confidence. Allies who once pledged loyalty to Antony reconsidered their position. Provinces formerly aligned with the Eastern Partnership defected to the rising Roman leader. Egypt stood increasingly alone. Cleopatra's first response was practical. She secured the treasury, gathered remaining forces, and reinforced the city's defences. Alexandria remained wealthy and fortified. Its harbour was still formidable. Supplies were stockpiled. The queen, who had once been cast into exile, now prepared to defend her capital against Rome itself. Antony attempted to rally his remaining troops. He sought to restore morale by emphasising loyalty and shared struggle. Cleopatra, equally determined, explored diplomatic channels. There were suggestions that she considered negotiating directly with Octavian, offering terms that might preserve her children's status or Egypt's autonomy. Octavian's objective was clear. He intended to bring Egypt under Roman control. The kingdom's wealth, particularly its grain, was too valuable to leave independent. Cleopatra's survival as sovereign would complicate consolidation. He advanced carefully, isolating Antony's forces and encouraging defections. In 30 BCE, Octavian reached the outskirts of Alexandria. Antony attempted resistance, leading a final engagement on land. The confrontation was brief and decisive. Antony's troops, outmatched and uncertain, faltered. Reports reached Antony that Cleopatra had taken refuge in her mausoleum and that she might have died. Believing her lost and his cause ended, Antony chose a Roman response to defeat. He fell upon his sword. The wound was not immediately fatal. When he learned that Cleopatra still lived, he was carried to her. Ancient accounts describe him being lifted through a window into the mausoleum where she had barricaded herself with trusted attendants. Their final meeting was brief. Antony died in Cleopatra's arms. His life, marked by military ambition and dramatic alliance, ended within the city he had once entered in triumph. Cleopatra now faced a solitary decision. Octavian entered Alexandria shortly afterward. He secured the city with minimal destruction, mindful of the value it represented. Cleopatra was taken into custody, but treated with outward respect. Octavian understood the importance of appearance. Public execution of a foreign queen could incite unrest. He intended to parade her in Rome as part of his triumph. Such displays were common in Roman celebration of victory. Captive rulers were led through the streets as symbols of conquest. Cleopatra recognized the humiliation implicit in this plan. Her life had been defined by sovereignty. To appear in chains before Roman crowds would erase the authority she had fought to preserve. She attempted negotiation. She sought assurances for her children. Octavian remained firm. Caesarion, a son of Julius Caesar, represented potential challenge. Cleopatra's daughters might be spared and integrated into Roman society. Her son's future was far less certain. Cleopatra requested permission to visit Antony's tomb. Octavian granted it, perhaps underestimating her resolve. Shortly afterward, events unfolded that would secure her place in history. The traditional account describes Cleopatra arranging for a venomous asp to be smuggled into her chamber, concealed within a basket of figs. Whether the method was precisely as described remains debated. Some historians suggest poison may have been applied differently. What is consistent across sources is her choice to end her life rather than submit to humiliation. On August 10th or 12th, 30 BCE, Cleopatra died in Alexandria. Two of her attendants, Eras and Charmian, are said to have followed her in death. When Octavian's men entered the chamber, they found the queen dressed in royal attire, positioned deliberately. Caesarion attempted to flee south, but was captured and executed. His death marked the end of the Ptolemaic line. Cleopatra's surviving children by Antony were taken to Rome and raised by Octavia, Antony's former wife. With Cleopatra's death, Egypt ceased to be an independent kingdom. It became a Roman province, governed directly by representatives of Augustus. The new title Octavian would soon assume. The vast resources of the Nile were incorporated into the Roman system. Cleopatra's final act ensured that she would not be remembered as a captive displayed in triumph. Instead, she became a figure of autonomy to the end. Her decision preserved dignity at the cost of survival. Alexandria transitioned under Roman administration without large-scale destruction. Temples continued to function. Trade resumed. Yet the era of Hellenistic sovereignty in Egypt had concluded. Octavian returned to Rome with victory secure. In 27 BCE, he was granted the title Augustus, marking the formal beginning of the Roman Empire. The republic that Cleopatra had observed during her time in Rome no longer existed in recognizable form. Her legacy endured in layered ways. Roman writers, influenced by Octavian's narrative, often portrayed her as dangerous and manipulative. Later generations re-examined her as strategist, linguist, and sovereign navigating extraordinary circumstances. The final days in Alexandria were not marked by surrender, but by decision. Cleopatra had faced exile, war, alliance, propaganda, and defeat. In her last act, she chose the manner of her exit. The asp, whether literal or symbolic, became emblem of her end. It represented not only death, but refusal to yield. As the Mediterranean adjusted to Roman rule, the memory of the last queen of Egypt lingered. Her reign had intersected with the fall of a republic and the rise of an empire. The doors of the mausoleum closed on a dynasty that had ruled since the time of Alexander's successors. Egypt entered a new chapter under Roman administration, its ancient identity preserved in ritual but governed from afar. Cleopatra's life had spanned conflict and transformation. Her final choice ensured that even in defeat she retained control over the narrative of her own end. History has never left Cleopatra in silence. From Roman poets to Renaissance painters, from stage performances to modern cinema, her image has been reshaped again and again. Some remember her as a seductress who brought powerful men to ruin. Others see her as a symbol of independence in a world dominated by empires. Between exaggeration and admiration, the human figure at the centre can become difficult to see. Behind the legend stood a woman born into a fragile dynasty, at a moment when Egypt's sovereignty was already narrowing. She did not inherit a stable kingdom. She inherited debt to Rome, rivalry within her own household, and a political landscape shifting toward consolidation under Roman authority. Her life unfolded not in isolation, but in constant negotiation with forces larger than herself. Cleopatra was not the first foreign ruler to sit on an Egyptian throne. Her ancestors had arrived as conquerors under Alexander's general. For 3 centuries, the Ptolemaic family balanced Greek heritage with Egyptian tradition. By her generation, that balance required careful management. Cleopatra embraced elements of both identities more fully than many before her. She learned the Egyptian language. She appeared in temples as pharaoh. She addressed priests directly. At the same time, she engaged with Roman generals as intellectual equal. Her education and multilingual ability set her apart within her own dynasty. Her alliances with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony were shaped by survival as much as emotion. Rome's military power determined the fate of neighbouring kingdoms. Cleopatra aligned with those who could secure her throne. The relationships that followed were neither accidental nor purely romantic. They were strategic choices within a constrained environment. Roman sources, particularly those aligned with Octavian's narrative, emphasized excess and manipulation. Cleopatra was portrayed as a temptress whose influence corrupted Antony. Such depictions served political purpose. They simplified a complex conflict into a moral contrast between Roman virtue and Eastern decadence. The reality was more layered. Cleopatra governed for more than 2 decades. She stabilized Egypt after civil war. She strengthened temple ties and maintained economic systems. Grain continued to flow. Trade routes remained active. She preserved Egypt's wealth long enough to make it the final independent Hellenistic kingdom. Her children were part of that vision. The donations of Alexandria were not impulsive spectacle alone. They represented an attempt to create continuity beyond a single generation. Cleopatra sought to position her heirs within a network of eastern territories, anticipating a Mediterranean divided between Roman and non-Roman spheres. Actium ended that possibility. Octavian's victory reshaped the political order decisively, yet Cleopatra's response to defeat reflected the same control she had exercised throughout her life. She chose not to become symbol of conquest in a Roman triumph. Her final act preserved dignity, even as it ended her dynasty. After her death, Egypt transitioned into Roman province. The ancient rituals of the Nile continued, but sovereignty shifted permanently. The Roman Empire under Augustus incorporated Egypt's resources into its expanding system. The Mediterranean entered a new phase. Cleopatra's memory endured because it marked a turning point. She stood at the intersection of 2 eras. Her reign overlapped with the fall of the Roman Republic and the rise of imperial rule. She represented the last assertion of Hellenistic monarchy, before Rome absorbed the East fully. In later centuries, writers and artists revisited her story with varying emphasis. Some focused on romance, others examined ambition. Modern scholarship often highlights her political intelligence and adaptability. She navigated exile, sibling rivalry, foreign intervention, and military defeat. She maintained authority longer than many male rulers in comparable circumstances. She governed a complex kingdom during one of the Mediterranean's most volatile transitions. Cleopatra's life invites reflection not because it is simple, but because it resists simplicity. She was neither caricature nor saint. She was a sovereign operating within the constraints of her time. The palace at Alexandria no longer stands. The harbour where fleets once assembled lies beneath modern development and shifting coastline. Yet the imprint of her decisions remains in the broader arc of history. Rome's transformation into empire cannot be separated from the conflict that culminated in Actium. Cleopatra's alliance with Antony shaped the narrative that allowed Octavian to present himself as Rome's defender. The propaganda that targeted her became part of imperial identity. When considering Cleopatra at the end of her life, it is easy to focus on spectacle. The image of the asp has endured for centuries, yet the larger story is quieter. It is the story of a ruler who adapted repeatedly to survive, who embraced education as tool of power, who balanced tradition and innovation within a kingdom under pressure. Her death closed the Ptolemaic chapter of Egypt's history. It also marked the completion of Rome's shift from republic to empire. The Mediterranean that followed was unified under Augustus in ways unimaginable during her youth. Cleopatra's name continues to evoke debate. Scholars examine sources critically, aware that much of what survives was written by those aligned with her conqueror. Each generation reassesses her motives and achievements. In the stillness that follows the telling of her life, the dramatic images soften. What remains is a woman shaped by circumstance, navigating structures she did not create but sought to master. She lived at a moment when kingdoms were absorbed and old orders dissolved. The last queen of Egypt did not surrender quietly. She acted until the final decision was hers alone. And somewhere along the edge of the Mediterranean, where the Nile meets the sea, the memory of her reign lingers not as spectacle alone, but as the final chapter of an ancient line that once balanced between sand and empire.